welcome to the Morbid Moonlight Monthly Update.
Hello, my name is Alex, and welcome to the first ever episode of the Month in Horror podcast, where I'll be giving my thoughts on horror films released this month, in this case during the month of March. It's not going to be an absolutely comprehensive look at every single horror movie of the month, because there's only so many films that I can ultimately watch during a month. Some movies I will actively choose not to watch, and others I feel like I probably shouldn't have watched. But during the month, I'll put as much effort into watching every new horror release as possible that I can. If for whatever reason some movies slip through the cracks, then that's just the way that is. Sometimes that means missing out on hidden gems, sometimes it means I just don't have to sit through every single piece of dross ever released in the horror genre. So I'd say for the most part I've done a pretty good job this month. I've seen 16 horror films released during the month of March. There are a few that I haven't got round to for whatever reason, some that were just released too late, like Godzilla vs. Kong, A Nest of Vampires, and of course there are other things that I just didn't quite get round to, that I just decided that I'd prioritise something else over it, and I ultimately decided that I didn't actually want to see these particular films. It may be for good, it may be for ill. Films that I didn't get around to seeing this month include Sun. I didn't get to see No Fear, that's K-N-O-W, No Fear. Honeydew, which was released to theatres, I think I didn't get a chance to see. The Canyonlands, it looked to be a kind of backwoods slasher thing I never got round to. I'd say there are maybe about half a dozen movies that if I had more time I probably would have watched, but I just at the end of the day didn't. I think I've done pretty well this month overall. There's been a very wide range of things released, a lot of different movies. So the idea here is that I'm going to go through each film as it's released in the release order, starting with the start of the month, going through to the very end of the month, and just giving them a short review and then giving a rating out of 5 stars. As you can see, this is quite a long podcast. If you don't necessarily have the patience to sit through the entire thing, you can maybe just jump to one specific review of a movie that you're interested in checking out, or a movie that you haven't seen, or a movie that you have seen and you want to know what I think about it. There will be timestamps in the description below. You can check those out if you want, or if you don't have the patience to actually sit through the entire thing, at the very end of the podcast there is a rundown of all my rankings for the month, putting each of the films in order from worst to best, along with my ratings. If you just want to jump to that, then that will be in the rankings and rundown section. I'll also be doing a brief little kind of award ceremony at the very end, where I'll be saying my favourite performance, my favourite soundtrack, best title, biggest disappointment, biggest surprise, just kind of honouring the best things that have come out this month. So overall, having watched 16 films this month, that is more than doubled the amount of 2021 horror films I've seen so far this year. I've not been putting in a conscious effort to watch every single movie ever released, but I think that the added benefit of reviewing them and thinking about them critically has actually helped me. It's enabled me to get more excited about watching new horror films as they come out. So whether you are somebody like the person that I've become, who has to watch every single new horror film as it comes out, you probably have seen all these already, you might want to check out what I have to say about them, or if you're just somebody looking for a new horror film to check out that's come out recently and you don't really know where to start, then hopefully there'll be something for you in this podcast to check out. And just for the record, I will not be spoiling any of these films, so you do not have to worry about that. I think the things that I was probably the most looking forward to this month were the Stylist from Arrow, that I was pretty excited about, the film Slaxx from Shudder, which had this crazy premise about a pair of killer jeans. I thought sounded pretty fun. I was looking forward to that, and a few other bits and pieces that kind of jumped out at me that I was looking forward to. And then there were the movies that I just went into completely blind, some of which shocked me, some of which surprised me, some of which I wished I had just never actually put the effort into watching. Most of these films are American. There are quite a few Canadian films which I've noticed, which is something that I will be talking about a lot this month. There are a couple of British films, there's a Russian movie, The Widow, and just overall quite an eclectic mix of movies. I wouldn't say there's any particularly huge kind of big tentpole movies. I suppose the biggest movie of the month was of course Godzilla vs. Kong, which releases on the 31st. Sadly I haven't got around to watching that yet. I just need to get that out of the way straight away. I suppose there's an argument about is it a horror film or not. it seems to be generally lumped in with horror movie coverage in general, so I suppose it does count. I probably will be checking that out. Whether that will be a separate review or whether that I'll stick that on to next month's remains to be seen at this point. But there aren't any especially huge standout movies, I have to say. There's nothing from big name directors in the genre, no particularly huge properties, no kind of sequels or anything. So what that means is we just get to see a broad range of movies from a broad range of directors. Something we do see a lot of this month, I have to say, is feature debuts, directors making their feature debuts, which is always interesting because you never know what you're going to get. And I think overall the month of March has brought some very unusual, very diverse and very interesting movies. So with that said, let's get underway and let's start off with our first review.
Don't get me wrong, I love traveling. I love constantly meeting new people. It's so inspiring.
Yeah. That's why I do hair.
Really?
Yeah. You get to go in and out of people's lives. You hear stories. You give life advice. It's almost like having a family.
So first up, we're going to be talking about The Stylist. Now, in February, the well-known Blu-ray and DVD cult label Arrow Video finally got into the streaming game with their own streaming service, the Arrow Player. Now, this is a place where you can basically stream a good range of their titles, you know, all their DVD releases. And unlike most streaming services, it actually offers you an option where you can watch, you know, some of the special features, which is one of the things that makes their physical media releases, you know, so sought after by collectors. It doesn't have everything, it doesn't have every single thing they've ever released, but it does offer a really good range of cult titles for people that are into that sort of film. But anyway, as with any streaming service, Arrow decided that they needed to have exclusives. And as far as I'm aware, the first of these exclusives was The Stylist. So The Stylist follows Claire, who's a successful young hairstylist, much sought after by her clients and doing well for herself. But she's also lonely, socially inept, and has a nasty habit of scalping her customers. So this is directed by Jill Gevorgisian, also known as, more helpfully, Jill 6. I believe this is her feature debut. It did quite well in the sort of the festival circuit and things. You know, it's getting some decent reviews. So it's worth mentioning first of all that this was definitely one of the films that I was the most excited about this month coming up. I wasn't following it particularly, but I did sign up to Arrow Player as soon as it was released, just because, you know, they had so much stuff in there that's really cool, that's really interesting, that, you know, that I didn't have on Blu-ray or DVD or whatever. And, you know, they were advertising this quite heavily. They were sort of pushing it as something to lure people to their streaming service over collectors who collect all the physical media. This was released on March the 1st. It will have a Blu-ray, a physical release later on in the month, I think June or July. It's a very interesting film, for one thing. It's, you know, it's a fairly kind of low-budget-y indie kind of movie. It's pretty small cast, pretty self-contained. It's a really sort of well-shot, atmospheric, nicely done, kind of giallo-inflected psychological thriller with definite horror elements in it. It's got that sort of really nice, dreamy, kind of echoey synth piano score all the way through that just sort of, it's really nice, it's sort of hypnotic, it draws you in. Cinematography is wonderful, everything looks really lush, the colours are amazing, the costumes are really cool. It's just a wonderful film to look at. It feels really nice, you know, really nicely directed with an eye for an image. But I think the main thing that kind of that's going to draw people into this is the central performance of Claire. Now, she is played by Najara Townsend, who you might know from the movie Contracted. She's done, you know, she's got a lot of credit. She's done a lot of other things as well. She's, you know, she's quite sort of well known. I think the sort of people that are going to seek this film out will probably know Najara Townsend already. But she, you know, she's definitely brings a lot to the table. You know, it's a really interesting insight into this particular character as she goes about her life. I think for horror fans, though, that the obvious superficial similarities are with the film Maniac, believe it or not. More specifically, the Maniac remake that came out, you know, nearly 10 years ago with starring Elijah Wood. The sort of the feel and the atmosphere is very similar to that film. It's obviously, it doesn't have that really grungy nastiness. It's very much a kind of an upper middle class version of that character, where Claire, unlike Frank Zito, Claire is she's well off. She's got a house, a car. She does find for herself, she's attractive. She's young. She on the surface, she seems like a totally functioning member of society. But the main, what the film's really looking at is the idea of sort of loneliness, that beneath the surface, people right next to us, there's this sort of really deep well of sort of twisted psychological issues. She's depressed, she's sociopathic, whatever. And she really makes you feel very sympathetic for her, which is interesting because, she scalps someone within the first 10 minutes or so of the film. The opening scene of the movie actually plays out more or less like an expansion of the original short film, The Stylist, which is you can view on the Arrow player, along with a range of sort of little featurettes and bits and bobs that add to your experience. It's interesting comparing the short film with the finished product, because although the setup, the opening of this particular movie definitely evokes that short film, but in the short film there's a lot more surface to her. You get the sense more that she's playing a character, and that when the moment comes when she eventually scalps her client, that's really the real her. Whereas in the finished film, she's a lot more sympathetic. There's a lot more sort of conflict, loneliness. It actually brings the scalping scenes into quite a contrast, because it almost doesn't feel in keeping with some of what we feel for her, that she's capable of these immense acts of violence. And I think that's very interesting, because it shows you the evolution of, essentially, the short film was one of these, it's a twist, it starts off as one thing, hairstylist, it's something a lot of people can relate to, and then bam, there's this twist, and she's actually scalping her. She's actually someone who's a lot darker. There's a lot more going on. I think the psychology of her character in the finished film, she's obviously, because it's feature length and we need to spend a lot more time with her, she's a lot more sympathetic in a sort of lonely, kind of pitiable way. But at the same time, there isn't necessarily a psychological consistency to it. You don't maybe get the sense that you can trace things, cause and effect. There's a scene where she's talking about not remembering her father, sort of talking about her parents, and there's the suggestion that this is something that's hinted at, that there's this backstory for the character, but it doesn't necessarily follow through into, okay, this happened to her, so that's why she does, this now. There's a lot of ambiguity, which is interesting. I think it definitely adds to it, because in the real world, you don't get these really obvious, trite kind of cause and effect things. And I think Claire's a character that sort of conveys, a range of things. She tries to fit into society, but she can't. She's very close to all these people that are talking to her, that are telling her about her life, but no one really asks her about herself until one of her clients, Olivia, played by Bree Grant, who's actually someone we'll be seeing more of this month. Olivia asks for Claire specifically for a big wedding. She says, oh, Claire's the only one who can do my hair or whatever. So there's a connection formed between Olivia and Claire that's interesting. And we do get this scene where Olivia and Claire are just sort of sitting down, and Claire's very much doing what she's used to, which is being on the fringes. Claire is asking Olivia all these questions. Olivia's answering them and more or less ignoring Claire. But there is a moment where it switches, and she says, oh, she starts asking Claire about herself, and it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. We definitely get the sense that this is something that nobody else has ever done before, which is why the sort of the central dynamic between these two women in this film, it's Claire trying to fit in, basically, to trying to live a normal life, even though she's got all this baggage around her. It's definitely not a film that takes place in remotely the real world. There isn't necessarily a sort of a through line of logic. For example, Claire is killing her customers, more or less. She kills at least two people that we see in this film. There are definitely more hinted at. In actual fact, there's a moment that directly calls back to the short film, which suggests that is actually in continuity with the rest of the film, which I think is a really interesting touch. But I think the idea that as a hairdresser would kill one of your clients and then could more or less get away with it is pretty unrealistic, if I'm honest. There's definitely been more of an investigation into what's happening, where are these people going, when did you last see her, she was at the hairdresser, who cut her hair, police interviewing her. But that's not really the thrust of this particular film, which again kind of reflects the Maniac remake, where it's more about this this character's psychological journey through a series of crisis points and seeing where it takes her, rather than this is a serial killer film about, a hairdresser gone mental, which is good. And again, one of the interesting things is that it is absolutely... One of the things I think is most interesting about it is that it is absolutely not a we live in society film. It's not the society has done this to Claire and this is why this is happening. She's a character with a lot of ambiguity. It's not necessarily obvious what is pushing her to do what she does, but we see her going through the motions and sort of wondering and really hoping for her to sort of succeed and to fit in, even though we know that by the point you've scalped your first victim, there's more or less no hope for you, that she's definitely on this road. But this relationship she has with Olivia kind of makes her think that she sees it almost as a way out, that she's finally found some part of society that's got a place for her, that she can maybe claw her way back to normality. But it's not a film about, everyone's being horrible to Claire, she's suffering, she's poor, she's run down, she can't cope with things. It's more about these really small sort of psychological little ticks in someone that on the surface has got so much going right for her. She's doing well, her customers like what she does, she seems to be getting on okay financially. On the surface, she can interact with people more or less, in a way that society would find acceptable. But she just doesn't work. No matter how hard she tries, she will always be this outsider. There's some really, really nice, sort of incredibly uncomfortable emotional scenes in this, which I think is nice. I think that's really good to see in horror. It's not just about the scalps, it's not about the gore or the violence. It's not a serial killer film. There's a lot of emotion, but it's very much also about the style. I think the style and the look of it's what's going to keep people coming back to this film. There are some things I don't particularly like about it. I mean, there's some lines of dialogue that I just feel are really, really on the nose, that are very obvious. Customers kind of saying things like, "Oh, I don't know anything about you," and she just sort of looks at them. Or there's one particular scene in a bathroom where Claire goes into a stall in the bathroom, shuts the door, and then a group of people that she was with come in and start talking about her behind her back in a way that she can hear it, and saying, "Oh, who's the weirdo," basically. And it's clunky, it's kind of obvious, it's a pivotal moment that kind of pushes her into something that happens later on. But it's very kind of, for a film that's not about obvious trigger points, it's not about an obvious psychological A to B to C, it's more about a sort of a nuanced journey that's frustratingly sort of oblique and hard to comprehend at times. There are definitely moments that feel very on the nose, very kind of trite, that are a bit... I feel you could have done that in a better way. But overall, it's a really interesting film. It's a really entertaining film. It looks wonderful. The central performance is fantastic. I think Brie Grant as Olivia is really interesting as well. I think there's a good interaction between these two. There are some chilling moments that will get to you, but I think it's more about this slow feeling of sort of sadness almost. It's a very sad, emotional journey with this character, and I think absolutely that it belongs to Najara Townsend as Claire. I think she's fantastic in it. I look forward to seeing more of her. I definitely look forward to seeing more of Jill Sixx's work, or Jill Gevorgisian's work, because I think this shows off a real flair for the material, real style. I think it's just a very good film. I was expecting something maybe a little more of a bite to it, something a bit more vicious, a bit more cruel. But I was pleasant. I can't say I was pleasantly surprised, because I was expecting it to be good. It was something I was looking forward to very much, and it definitely delivered. I hope that if Arrow gets more of these exclusive films for their streaming site, that they're going to be of this high quality, because I think this is a really good film. I think overall I'd come in at 4. I think I'd come in at 4 stars for this, with the proviso that I think that if I watched it again, I could even come up on that. I could go higher. I don't think it's one of those films that you watch it once and you never particularly want to watch it again. It's just a really nice, just sort of soak in this world. Even though it's very emotional, very uncomfortable, it's just a really strong, really interesting, really stylish, vivid film, and I would definitely recommend it to anyone.
Dad, wake up.
What?
saw someone outside.
What?
A man was in our backyard.
Honey, that's the man.
What?
The man that comes every night and tries to kill us. Okay, well, get up. You don't want to be caught in bed. That's the worst place you can be. Wow. Just really getting to it. Not wasting any time.
Who is that man?
Better hope he doesn't have any good weapons tonight. May, come on, get up. We have to fight for our lives now.
So next up, we have the film Lucky, released on the 4th of March. This concerns a suburban woman fighting to be believed as she finds herself stalked by a threatening figure who returns to her house night after night. When she can't get help from those around her, she is forced to take matters into her own hands. Now, I think perhaps the most interesting thing about this film is that it stars and is written by Bree Grant, who is an actress that we saw, of course, in The Stylist. She played Olivia in The Stylist. I thought she was very good in that particular film. She's written, she's got a number of writing credits to her name. She also wrote and directed the movie 12-Hour Shift that came out last year, which was this sort of very self-consciously quirky kind of black comedy set in a hospital about kind of the black market organ trade, which is very interesting, very unusual, stylish. I have to say, first off, I think that the script for this film is a definite step up from 12-Hour Shift. It's described as a mind-bending slasher film, which I think I can obviously see what they're getting at, but it's not really a slasher film by any stretch of the imagination. Mind-bending, yeah, I guess so. This is available on Shudder. So first up, it is directed by Natasha Kermani. It's got a very kind of... I don't think that the visuals are anything too impressive. I don't think it reveals any great flair for sort of horror or for the dramatic particularly. It kind of plays out like a fairly blandish kind of TV movie. The lighting's quite flat. Scenes are sort of functional rather than being played for effect ever. And I don't particularly think that's a bad thing. I'm a big fan of sort of functional storytelling. I don't think you need to get really pretentious with what you're doing. It initially at first seems quite straightforward. Bree Grant plays May, who is a self-help author writing these books, the latest of which is called Do It Alone. And the central conceit of this is self-help author who has to learn to help herself. The thing about this particular character is I feel that it could be saying things more interesting than it is ultimately chose to say. I don't think it's really a horror film. I think it's more of just a thriller with a kind of fantasy element. I did enjoy this film whilst I was watching it. It kind of makes it very obvious early on that it's not playing in the real world. It starts off where she's in the house, and then her husband says the man's going to be coming in to attack us later tonight, we have to get ready. And she's saying, what are you talking about? And then the man indeed does break in, attacks her, she fends him off, and then she tells the police, she's telling people about it, and they don't believe her. Oh, it's not that they don't believe her, it's that they sort of dismiss it, they don't seem to think it's anything too important. And this happens again and again, and each time May's getting sort of angrier, she's fighting harder, she's telling people what's happening, getting nothing really back from them, and it's confusing. But the biggest issue I have with this is it's so obvious that we're watching a film with a twist in it, and everything in it is moving towards this one central twist, and that very much robs the actual drama of any ability to surprise us as an audience. We don't think, what's going on, what's going to happen next. We're sitting there thinking, okay, this is obviously not meant to be taken literally. This is obviously trying to make some metaphorical point. What is it? And I think there's far too much time spent on repetition here. I think we see the same things over and over again. We get the point. I personally think this would have worked better as a short, maybe about half an hour, maybe a segment in an anthology. I don't think it's got enough narrative depth to justify something this long. It's worth noting that this is actually played quite well with the non-horror crowd. It's getting pretty decent reviews from people that aren't particularly that into horror films. I think if you're sort of attuned to the particular message of this film, if that message gels with you, if that's something that you're looking for be dealt with in a film, then I guess that you're probably going to be more lenient to this than a hardcore horror fan expecting this to be a slasher film, a sort of meta slasher film with a twist, as opposed to a quite heavy-handed allegorical kind of film. It's interesting to note that this has been released on Shudder, because I don't especially think that this is going to be the kind of film that would appeal to Shudder users in general, who are kind of expecting something more cutting edge, something more of the moment and more unique. I think when you're watching it, I certainly was hoping that it wasn't going to make the point that that it eventually ended up making, because that was the most obvious thing you could possibly do. The allegory is just really on the surface all the way through. There's no ambiguity, there's no particular depth to anything or significance beyond the really, really obvious, which, you know, I mean, I can't say that I was expecting anything truly mind-blowing from this, but I think if you're making a film like this that so clearly is playing in the realms of fantasy, you expect that it could do a lot more than it ultimately does, because it never really slides fully into fantasy until the last half of the third act. I'm going to make a fairly unfair comparison here with the film Carnival of Souls, which is a film which has got a very famous twist at the end, a film that's a firm favourite of a lot of horror fans. It's definitely a firm favourite of mine, but that's a film that takes the knowledge of its final twist and uses it throughout the film to imbue it with as much texture, as much atmosphere as it possibly can. Whereas this, once you know what's happening at the end of it, then there's really no reason why you have to sit through the rest of it ever again. It uses its fantasy in the most kind of surface level way possible to make pretty obvious points. One of the things that really bothers me in this is I think it feels like it's afraid to interrogate its own characters. It doesn't feel like we're seeing characters playing out personal issues or dilemmas or stories. Every single character in it is just a literal tool just to be used to service an allegory, basically. It's so didactic, it's so on point, and everything is put to use in service of putting its point across to us in a way that makes sure that we know it's really kind of hitting you over the head with it. I think for this to be successful, it really needed to have a lot more of a twist. It really needed to play into the fantasy and the unusual aspects of it that are what make it unique. A lot of the attack sequences are very obvious. The imagery in them is very kind of surface level. The masked killer in it, he wears a kind of a mask, not unlike the killer in Alice, Sweet Alice, this kind of semi-opaque kind of face-hugging thing. But all the imagery in those attack scenes is sort of direct quotations from John Carpenter's Halloween. It's stuff that we can easily relate to and see and know instantly what we're being told is happening, rather than actually having to think about anything that's going on. We just know, okay, this is a man with a knife that's attacking us. We've seen this all before. We know what it means. The characters don't react to things that are happening to them in a way that's interesting or unique or brings anything special to the table. When it does descend into fantasy, it's rarely ever brings any atmosphere with it. It tends to be more about a sense of unease, things being askew, not quite right, a sort of, okay, what's going on here? I can see something's not right, but what is it? And our lead character trying to come to terms with that. That said, though, there is a big dilemma at the heart of this particular film, and that is the fact that Bree Grant is in every scene of it. She's very likeable, she's very charismatic, she's a very good actress, but she's also written it. So I would say she gives a very good performance. I'd say she's super likeable and she carries you through it in a way that I think a lesser actress wouldn't. But at the same time, she has written it, which is a bit of a problem, because I feel that the script is severely lacking. I don't think it's anything special, so I almost feel guilty about criticising the script because I like her performance so much. It does seem very unfair to say that I think that she's a much better actress than she is a writer. Interestingly, I think that if we compare it to the film that she wrote and directed last year, 12 Hour Shift, which she didn't actually act in as well, I think that she, as a director, has actually got quite an interesting eye for an image. She plays with music quite well. That film was quite well cast. I don't really know anything about the behind the scenes of this, but I think if she could have directed it as well as having written it, then she'd have done a much better job, I think. I think she might have been able to elevate it to a slightly higher level. ultimately I think the script does need a lot more polish. I think it needs more going on in it, more depth, more nuance. But at the same time, it does kind of carry you through. It's reasonably interesting, even though the payoff isn't particularly satisfying. I wouldn't even qualify it as a twist because it's so kind of obvious all the way going through. I think ultimately I can't honestly say that I'd recommend it. It's okay for a one-time watch because you're sort of thinking, okay, what's going to happen? Brie Grant does kind of lead you through it because we kind of care for her because she's a good actress. It absolutely does not need to be as long as it is, and it's not by any means a long film. It's about 80 minutes. I think that in all fairness to this film, I'm going to give Brie Grant the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to give it 3 stars, I think, because it is okay, it is fine for a one-time watch. There's a few vaguely interesting kind of images at the end, even though conceptually it's not that engaging. Watch it one time. I could honestly never see myself watching this ever again because it's so one note. The style is lacking. It's absolutely not a horror film. It's a very obvious kind of preachy parable. That said, yeah, it's okay-ish. It could be a lot better, but at the end of the day, it makes its point. I think I was just wanting a lot more from this. I just expect it to be a lot more clever, a lot more interesting than it was, and not just an extended metaphor for something that could have been conveyed in much less time. So yeah, 3 stars. Not particularly distinguished, not particularly scary, not particularly atmospheric or well directed, but it's just interesting enough to keep you going.
I don't feel like being sandwiched between wasted white girls wearing ill-fitted neon leggings and flower crowns.
Oh, come on, you would be so lucky.
I get enough of that on Instagram, okay? Bunch of millennial sheep heading to the slaughter.
Honey, I am an excellent shepherd.
Just not a good sister. I'm kidding.
So next up we're going to be looking at the film Dreamcatcher, which is the feature debut of director Jacob Johnston. Now, Jacob Johnston is somebody who has worked as a visual supervisor on more or less every single Marvel MCU film that's been released since about 2010, so he's got a good amount of credits to his name, but this is his first attempt at directing. So the plot concerns a group of young teens, sort of early 20s, young, attractive people that get invitations to an exclusive music event known as Cataclysm. At Cataclysm, the headline act is a DJ called DJ Dreamcatcher, who wears this really quite interesting, it's kind of like a modernised metallic sort of plague doctor kind of mask with a hood up. It's quite a sort of a visually striking look. You know, they're all out there, they're all partying, they're all enjoying it, they're all having the time of their lives. And then one of them gets involved with DJ Dreamcatcher, they take drugs, one of them dies, and then it kind of turns into a sort of, I know what you did last summer kind of thing, where they all agree to sort of hush up this murder. The stakes being that if it gets out, then DJ Dreamcatcher's career is going to be ruined. At the same time, they're all riven by this conflict within the group, and then one by one they start getting picked off. So obviously the comparisons that are being made with this particular film are with the Scream 90s era sort of floating head movies, where all the cast are just incredibly ultra attractive, everything's really slick, everything looks really good, the dialogue's super sharp, it's got that sort of meta-awareness where the characters are commenting about their own state of affairs. None of the dialogue sounds realistic, it's not really trying for that, it's all this kind of ultra stylized kind of stuff. The thing to note is that when Scream came out, so Scream is 25 years old at this point, which is crazy to think about, but when Scream came out, this kind of dialogue was pretty new. It was incredibly influential, and it led to this whole spate of Scream imitators, the Floating Heads era, which then became popularized in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so there were lots of more or less all sort of teen dramas or teen horror films of that period adopted this particular style of dialogue. And it was quite fresh, it was interesting, it was something we hadn't seen before, where all the dialogue was this very staged, very stylized stuff. But now, I feel that we've seen this sort of stuff so much that we're getting a film now which is calling back to that in a nostalgic way, in a way that a lot of horror directors call back to the 80s. We're now getting films that are calling back nostalgically to the mid-90s, which is kind of crazy to think, because, I imagine in a lot of horror fans' memories that still feels fairly recent. The sort of immediate point of reference for people these days would be shows on the CW in which everyone is really slick, really well-groomed, attractive, everything feels very sexually charged, all the dialogue's very sharp, ultra-posed, every single word is carefully chosen, everything's a sort of a slick, very wordy, kind of sarcastic put-downs. It's all very high-level, back and forth banter. And I suppose for people to whom that sort of thing holds a place in their heart, this is a film that does have something to offer. It's set in this kind of sort of electronica kind of world where everything's sort of pulsing beats and you've got that flashing kind of neon lighting, which is quite a striking look. I can't say it's particularly well exploited in the more atmospheric scenes, in the horror scenes particularly, but I think the thing that's most notable about this is that, again, it doesn't have much of a strong genre sensibility in the same way that a lot of 90s teen slashers of the Scream era did. That was an era in which they were attracting actors of a higher caliber, relatively speaking, to what audiences had been used to in the 80s. They were attracting names that would appeal to a teen crowd. And the kills were never up to much. There was never particularly much gore. The atmosphere was of a fairly kind of light TV kind of feel. They always felt very clean, very polished, and almost slightly apologetic. They always felt like they just happened to be horror films, but they were more interested in the teen drama kind of side of things. And Dreamcatcher very much continues that particular feel. So again, one of the biggest problems I have with this is that it's 108 minutes long, which is way too long for this kind of thing. And I chalk that down to the fact that this is a directorial debut of somebody with enough clout that they can afford to say, I'm not cutting this, I'm keeping it as long as I want it to be. Director Jacob Johnson also writes this, which again means that we're getting something that's quite auteur and quite personal. And that extends to an unwillingness to cut extraneous material. I think when we get to the end, when we see where this is actually all going, you realise there is an awful lot of stuff that could have been cut out. It's way too long. It seems a lot more concerned with not so much character dramas, but in this very backbiting, bitchy soap opera in a lot of ways. That's kind of showing us the music industry as a place that's just riven with backbiting and petty rivalries and jealousies. And the industry as a whole is exemplified by the character of Josephine, played by Adrienne Wilkinson, in this incredibly camp, incredibly over-the-top performance, which feels like something out of Dynasty or Dallas or something, this really kind of ridiculous, over-the-top performance. Although it must be said that nobody in this is delivering what I would consider a realistic or particularly memorable performances. Everything feels very artificial, very, again, stylized. It's got a very glossy kind of music video feel to a lot of it. None of the characters in it are at all likeable. I don't feel anything for anyone in this, and I feel like we're not supposed to particularly like anyone in it. I think if we're being charitable, we could say it's going for kind of a Greek tragedy, or failing that, it's a kind of giallo where everything's very interconnected and it's all about relationships, not romantic relationships, but sort of these very twisted links between all the characters that get tangled up, and there's betrayal and then there's fallings out and what have you. And it quickly becomes a lot of arguing and a lot of just sort of verbal posturing. It's a series of sort of bitchy put-downs with very attractive people in very sort of glossily lit apartments with this kind of light electronica beat kind of going in the background. If it is a film with a low budget, it doesn't betray that at all in anything other than, I suppose, the caliber of some of the acting. The acting's not fantastic. It's passable, I guess, for people that are used to the kind of 90s, the Floating Heads era. It kind of feels in keeping with a lot of that. I think there's so many subplots in this, it feels like there isn't enough room left for an actual plot. It's all a series of small interpersonal conflicts that never really coalesce into a single cohesive narrative, which is disappointing, because I have to say I think that the end is really interesting, and it's one of those films where I think if I'd switched it off before the last 15 minutes, I would have probably liked it a lot less than I did. I think it does have a good end. It's got an interesting twist that makes you think. I think it actually fools you into thinking that the movie's actually more tolerable than it is. But again, when you get to the finale and this big reveal, it makes you realise that there's no reason you had to sit through all this soap opera bullshit, and you could have just cut out, realistically, about half an hour of stuff. I think its biggest failings are that it doesn't do much at all with its horror. It doesn't have particularly much of an atmosphere. The killings feel kind of matter of fact. It feels more like maybe a couple episodes of a TV drama squidged together. It feels like something that you could watch on the CW, quite frankly. And I mean, if that appeals to you, then I imagine this film's got something for you. If that sounds appalling, then probably not. I don't think it's going to particularly play well with the horror crowd. Although that said, there's one or two sort of moments of gore that are quite okay. There's the mask for the killer in this is the DJ Dreamcatcher mask, this sort of high-tech kind of twist on the Plague Doctor kind of thing. Looks pretty cool. It's a nice image. It's again more shot with a music video sensibility than a particular horror feel. There's a few kind of good, witty, kind of sarcastic lines in this that sort of might appeal to you if you're into that kind of thing. If not, then it'll seem interminable. The characters do come out with very earnest Shakespeare quotes at one point. They're quoting Macbeth, which, when it's played out ultra seriously, is a problem. It just feels incredibly trite and tacky and like it's trying to be something way more than it is. I think at best this is a soap opera. It doesn't benefit from attempts to be worthy, attempts to be deeper than it actually is. It's very surface level. There are some just really appalling lines of dialogue that make you cringe, but at the same time it's not necessarily puncturing anything that would otherwise feel particularly memorable or interesting or realistic even. I think Jacob Johnson as a director probably isn't somebody that's got much of a future in the horror genre, I would say. He's obviously got quite a good eye for an image, but again, it's images of the sort that you'd see in adverts. It's not images imbued with any sense of vibrancy in a horror atmospheric sense. So I think he'll probably go on to direct more things. I'd probably suggest that he doesn't focus on horror particularly. I'd say his future lies more in dramas. I was going to say TV, but that does sound harsh. It sounds like I'm relegating him. I don't think he's particularly at flaw in his direction. There's a few moments of sort of shaky cam in the more sort of hectic scenes, in the stalk and slash moments, but I feel the script's more geared towards scenes of characters bitching at one another and buff, sort of well-groomed guys with perfect hair walking about with their shirts off. So again, if that appeals to you, then maybe have a look. I honestly don't know who this film's going to particularly satisfy. It's done pretty badly critically from what I've seen so far, although I have to say a lot of people are really slamming this. I don't think it deserves that. I think it's okay. I think it's watchable. I think it's way too long. I think the dialogue is very stylized. I think the acting's not brilliant, and in some places pretty awful. Interestingly, I think if you are somebody that just adored the 90s floating head era and you really want to see somebody deliver quite an effective evocation of that era, then I think Dreamcatcher does a pretty good job of that, actually. I mean, I can't say it's a genre that I've got any particular fondness. I've always thought of it as horror light. I prefer, an 80s slasher that's got a lot more of that feel, a lot more about the fun of it, the chase, the drama, rather than the characters and the relationships and sort of soap opera kind of bitching. But I think overall I'm going to come in at 2.5 stars on this. I could come a little bit lower. I could say maybe 2 stars, but I think 2.5 stars because I do like the twist. I think the music's quite fun. I think the acting is of a sort that I can't necessarily criticize it objectively because it's very much style rather than performance that you can judge objectively. Direction's okay. It's not totally painful. It passes the time okay-ish. It's way too long. I think that's going to put a lot of people off, but it's okay, It's alright for a one-time watch. And again, if it appeals to you, this particular type of movie, then I would say check out Dreamcatcher. Don't expect too much, but it's alright. That's all I can say. It's alright.
1,000 people lived in Sugar Hills, Ariane. 1,000. All gone. Even with a great fire, people don't just disappear like that. Towns don't. Something else happened here. Something more. And I'm here to discover what that is and document it and bring it home. So, truth, I guess, is what I'm hoping to find.
So next up is a film called The Devil Below, which was released on VOD on the 5th of March. So this is basically quite a throwback creature feature kind of film. Involves a group of characters wandering out into the woods, finding a big hole, falling in, encountering monsters that try and kill them and they run away. You know, obviously there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's essentially the basics of it. It's not a film that's particularly strong on plot, quite frankly. I think if you want an idea of what kind of film this is, basically imagine The Descent, but filmed with really sort of bleach, washed out colours, a really basic kind of nuts and bolts cast, but with none of the elegance or the beauty or none of the majesty of that particular film. Sort of first half's wandering about in the woods, and then it moves on to underground action sequences. It is a creature feature, at least nominally. I mean, we don't exactly get to see much of these creatures at all. They're kept out of the frame for the most part. It's not particularly clearly filmed, so it's a very simplistic kind of film. It's the sort of film you go into and expect, okay, this is going to be a really basic, minimalist, back to basics kind of creature feature film. It didn't even quite manage that, if I'm being honest. I think the biggest letdown here is the fact that the script is really abominable. I think none of the actors managed to bring any of it to life. I think it's filled with endless verbal posturing. There's a scene about half an hour into the film where two characters sit down and have to explain to us, the audience, who each of the characters are one by one, then explain the purpose of why they're all there, and basically set up the whole rest of the film with just this really bad, clunky, expository dialogue. And this is after we've spent, 20 minutes with these characters already, so there's no excuse for this kind of thing. More or less every single scene that involves dialogue of any length is just characters expostulating. Obviously none of the acting is fantastic in this. There's a few people that are sort of functional and okay. Will Patton's in this briefly. I think this really clunky dialogue and shoddy acting would be excusable if this was a film that didn't feel so self-important. I get the feeling that the writers of this particular movie think that they're writing something with great significance and great depth, which is fair enough. I think if they just concentrated on making this a real sort of nuts and bolts group of people get attacked by monsters kind of film, then it would be a lot better than it was. There's no chemistry whatsoever with any of the characters. It's one of those films where you really struggle to know the name of any character or even care for any of them. When they do eventually start getting killed off, which is inevitable in this kind of film, there's no point to any of it. It just goes on. It's just who's going to die next. The main actress in this, Alicia Sands, brings nothing to the table at all. She's just really sort of monotone, really uninteresting. It's such a limited film that I feel like it's the kind of movie that you want to give the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, it's low budget, they're doing the best with what they've got, but they're not even doing that. They don't set things up well. There's so much bad explaining what's going on, dialogue. About half of it's just really bad exposition. The other half is stuff that's trying to sound sort of clever but just ends up sounding really awful. It's the kind of dialogue that I think good actors would have trouble delivering convincingly, and if I'm being honest, none of these people are what I would consider good actors. It's a film that's just jam-packed full of cliches, but none of it's handled with any wit or self-knowledge or any love for the material whatsoever. It just feels really perfunctory, like these are people just making the cheapest possible movie in the hope that they can sell it to horror fans, because horror fans are more forgiving than a general audience tends to be. It's really not a film that you can say too much about. I can't imagine it having any significant kind of life. I can't imagine people really remembering this at all. It really is the kind of film that's just destined to be forgotten. It's directed by Brad Parker, whose only directorial credit to date was 2012's The Chernobyl Diaries, which is quite incredible when you consider that it's taken him almost 10 years to direct his second film. He's primarily a visual effects supervisor, which is interesting because it isn't a film that displays any great affection or talent for its own special effects. Visually really uninteresting. It slips from sort of murky darkness into found footage. There's segments of it that take a sort of found footage aspect where we're seeing things through cameras, which is a pretty basic low budget kind of shortcut for kind of suggesting a sense of immediacy or I suppose realness to proceedings. But I think it all really does come down to just how kind of shonky the script is. There's maybe one moment of sort of self-awareness or irony with in the midst of all these incredibly pompous, self-important sort of monologues on destiny and doing what you have to do and things, where one character spouts a particular bit of wisdom to somebody else who says, oh, is that a Nietzsche quote? And she says, no, it's a Yoda quote, which is honestly about the height of wit that you get in this kind of film. I mean, I admit I'm a sucker for a good, man in a monster suit film as much as anybody. I mean, they look okay, they look pretty decent, but we honestly don't get any chance to see them. They're not handled with any sense of menace or gravitas to make them seem like anything other than people in monster suits, and even then, they're so rarely seen. I think that's it's kind of, you can see why they're doing it, because obviously it's low budget, and maybe if we got more of a chance to see these the effects for the monsters, that it would probably reveal a lot more shortcomings. But I think if you're making a film called The Devil Below about sort of underground monsters, you need to just go the whole hog and actually show them. Just put all your effort into making them look as good as possible and handling them with a sense of the dramatic to make them really seem like an actual threat, as opposed to just something that's lurking about largely off screen. It really needs to just commit to being a good old-fashioned monster movie a lot more than it does. I'd be lying if I said that the end doesn't have a certain something. I mean, interestingly enough, it actually brought to mind less The Descent and more Contamination, which I think is quite interesting. That's a film that doesn't get referenced enough. It was, this Italian alien clone from the early 80s. I think there's moments in the finale that kind of suggest the finale of that film, which is fun, but it's probably a coincidence. I can't imagine that this is a film made by people that are incredibly literate in the genre, if I'm being honest, which is probably unfair to them, but it really doesn't feel like it's got any kind of awareness of the tropes that it's playing with. There's a few moments of sort of obvious kind of hold your breath suspense that work about as well as those moments can do, just in a purely kind of mechanical way. Nothing special though, realistically. I know you need to be fairly forgiving with a film on this level, but it's really not the kind of film I could in all conscience recommend to anybody. It's 90 minutes long. It doesn't need to be that long. It could have done what it needed to do in about an hour, I think, but just padded out to feature length. So I think overall, in all conscience, I'm going to have to come in at a 2 stars for this. I wouldn't recommend it. It's okay-ish for a kind of one-off watch if your expectations are incredibly low and you're willing to be disappointed. The end's okay-ish. It's not worth sitting through. Really didn't like the characters, really didn't like the script. Just really, really forgettable and uninteresting.
It's a very large home, and there's only 3 of us here.
Let me be very clear. It is in your very best interest to see that the first and the second floors are packed and shipped by first light tomorrow morning. The basement and the attic are not your concern. I will handle them myself. That is 4 times your rate.
That's a bit unconventional.
But we love 4 times our rate.
So next up we have a film called Stay Out of the Attic, or more provocatively titled Stay Out of the Fucking Attic, or Stay Out of the Effing Attic. This is a film released on the 11th of March to Shudder. It's a film that concerns a group of ex-convicts turned movers who get a job to move the possessions of an aging German man from his house 2 floors but not the attic. He gives them an incredibly large amount of money to move as quickly as possible. They start to get the sense that something's going on. Things are not as they seem. They start to find strange artifacts, strange bits and bobs lying about through the house, and slowly but surely we learn a terrible secret about this old man, that he is in fact a Nazi and his genetic experiments are being kept alive in the attic. Now, it's a film that sounds like it's got a real kind of pulpy, crazy, balls to the wall kind of aesthetic to it. The title alone is provocative. It makes you think that you're going to be watching something that's quite metal, quite crazy. I think Stay Out of the Effing Attic isn't the best title in the world because it makes it sound a lot more kind of throwaway than it does. It's one of those titles that's trying to kind of antagonize you. I think Stay Out of the Attic is a much better title. I think it could do without the needless profanity, if I'm honest. I honestly can't think of particularly many films that I like that have got profanity in the title, for the simple reason that doing so makes it hard to advertise your film, which is why it's got a range of other titles, from the bleeped out version to just simply Stay Out of the Attic. I actually think a better title for this would be Don't Go in the Attic. There's a long history of films in the horror genre that have used the word don't at the start of them. You know, don't go in the house, don't look in the basement, don't answer the phone, don't open till Christmas. It's something that's got this rich tradition, and it would straight away tell you, okay, we're working with something that knows it's horror literate, it's aware of this tradition. But anyway, title aside, this is, I believe, the feature debut of director Jaron Lauder. So first things first, It's a very self-contained film. It takes place almost entirely in the one house. I'd imagine it's pretty low budget. It's got very few speaking roles in it. I think at most there's 5 speaking parts in the whole film. I don't think that's a problem. I'm quite a fan of contained horror films because they encourage the creatives to be inventive with what they've got, to really think through the situation rather than just doing whatever they want. There's a sense of realism and immediacy to it. I'd say this is pretty good at what it does. It uses its space, it uses its limits well. There are a trio of these moving people who are very likable. I think they're well acted. You get a real sense that these are real people. I really enjoyed their interactions in the first sort of half hour of this film. It's got a kind of fun vibrancy to it that I like. I think it's a dying art to make really likable characters in horror films, especially likable working class characters. I feel like more commonly these days we're seeing these kind of upper middle class people with affectations, very kind of sarcastic, emotionally withdrawn people that we're meant to like, who feel completely fake and insincere, that feel like we're watching characters created by people who don't have any understanding of actual real human beings. These characters feel real. They do feel fairly kind of cartoony, but they are likable. There is a scene where they have a kind of bonding session, which is basically them going round one by one and explaining their dark secrets in their past, which does feel clunky. I could have done without that. I could have done with characters revealing their sort of hidden secrets in a more organic way, rather than just literally stopping the film and saying, okay, this is what's wrong with this character, this is the dilemma they have. I always think that feels very clunky. But they are well performed. I think particularly Ryan Francis as the lead turns in a very credible, understated performance that I like. It does kind of go off the rails a bit when the shit hits the fan later on, but there's a real nice sense of these characters in a space and just exploring it and finding out things, going about their duties, that feels, again, organic. It's shot quite nicely in a way that kind of suggests something's going on. It suggests there's a sense of menace to these scenes early on that creates a sense of foreboding, which I like. It's not overdone. It's just sort of carefully chosen camera angles and things. As the sense of dread sort of builds up in the first act, and then it finally culminates in these characters realizing what they've got themselves in for, then the switch is flipped, and then the rest of the film is them kind of dealing with the horrors within this house. So straight away, I think my biggest problem with this is that the main character is a Nazi, and not just any Nazi, by the way. I'll tell you exactly who he is, because I think that might be a bit of a spoiler, but it's exactly who you'd expect him to be, shall we say. And I think that from this beginning, where you get these sort of fun characters, it very quickly becomes a lot darker than it needs to be. There's some real nasty, kind of cruel scenes that I think I could have done without. It's quite difficult to pin down exactly why I feel it goes off the rails when it starts embracing its horror aspects. But I think it's the fact that when you're playing with Nazis, there's 2 ways you can go. One is that you can make them these very pulpy, comic booky kind of shorthand for the ultimate evil. We all know that when we see the swastika, we know exactly what we're dealing with. We know that these are people that we don't have to have explained to us are evil incarnate, and that's pretty straightforward. Or the other way is you can actually get into the realities of it, which aren't pulpy or fun or comic booky, and that are very real, very brutal, very, very unpleasant. The sort of thing that I don't really think has much place in genre material, especially genre material of this level. What I was thinking going into it was Nazi experiments being kept alive in the attic. They get out, they terrorize these people. I was expecting the Nazi experiments to be more along the lines of like a Nazi zombie thing or something, where he's basically created monsters, and the genetic experiments are a shorthand for, okay, here's a prosthetics-laden monster that would be attacking them, and it would be a series of, here's these horrifying genetic creatures attacking them. But that isn't at all what Stay Out of the Attic is. It quickly becomes something that's actually quite depressing, it's actually quite gruesome, but in a way that isn't a sort of a fun, pacey, ridiculous film that would justify the title. I think it plays to far more serious, far more upsetting imagery. I actually think that after the first half hour it descends quite rapidly into something that throws away a lot of the goodwill that it's built up. Even the characters for the sort of the latter half of the film, once they're put under the test, I think a lot of the acting becomes very, very over the top. As I mentioned, Ryan Francis, his character has a past that allows him to basically give us these very heavy-handed info dumps where he's explaining what's happening. It's got moments of sort of torture porn in it that they are what they are, but I think the main problem is that you've got a cast of essentially 3, maybe 4 likeable characters in this throughout, so we know it's not going to be a film, it's not a slasher film where the characters are going to get picked off one by one. It's also a film in which we unusually feel very attached to these characters, so when we see things played out to them, it actually hits us on a fairly emotional level. But it's not a body count film by any means, and it makes it pretty obvious straight away that it's not going to be that. So all that we've got left is maiming, running away, and torturing to the point of death. There are some gruesome things in it that I think just tickle the boundaries of bad taste. There's a gas chamber scene in a bathroom which I just can't get my head around why anyone thought it was a good idea, because it's such a ludicrous pulpy concept tied into something that's so incredibly unfunny. Now I know this sounds like I'm being very PC and very easily offended. I don't get offended by any of this stuff, it doesn't really bother me, but at the same time it is a film that's playing in this incredibly PC, incredibly woke culture. I can see a lot of people being offended by this, and I think being offended by it is probably what the director is going for, which is why it's got this very antagonistic title. I do understand that, I do understand it's going to attract some attention. I can definitely see people strongly disliking this. I think as a film it's not very good. I think it's got its moments, but it's very hard to enjoy it because it's so cruel, because the images it's playing with aren't funny on any level. They aren't entertaining, grisly horror images. They're images of real world horrors that just manage to get under your skin enough that you think, I shouldn't be enjoying this. It's not good enough to embrace that the torture porn and the unpleasant scenes aren't memorable enough to really, there's a certain restraint in them that you end up feeling like you're not actually getting what you want, no matter what you want from this, which is a shame, because I can't dismiss it out of hand as crap, because it's a good exercise in low budget filmmaking. It's aware of its constraints and it plays to its strengths, but at the same time it's sufficiently grisly that you can't enjoy it as a fun, gory horror film, and it's too much fun to get to be really affected by it. I think the comic book abbreviated shorthand of a lot of it, where a lot of it's playing to a very simplistic level, means that you can't really be affected by anything that's happening because it seems too cartoonish, even though we're dealing with characters and undergoing incredibly unpleasant things. There are some moments that I guess do descend into ludicrousness. There's a scene at the very end involving a tattoo that is got a certain kind of ballsy bravado to it, but it is very stupid. It tries, but at the end of the day, it's just not a film I can imagine really going back to too much, although I could probably see myself watching it again, because I did enjoy quite a lot of it, but I think it loses its focus. I think it should have played into something a lot more disposable. I think it actually should have been more violent than it was. I don't think it's particularly that gory. I think it's more a film that will get under your skin with unpleasant images that aren't especially visceral or graphic, but they're just unpleasant enough that they sort of make you think, oh, this isn't fun at all. If I had to fix this film, I'd make it more of a body count film. I'd have had more characters, more movers coming in. I'd have the genetic experiments being a lot more fun, a lot more just monsters coming out and attacking people and fucking shit up. I think that would have been fun, even though the subject matter isn't fun, and I think it would have allowed a lot more of the ridiculous things to play out in a lot less jarring way. But at the same time, I have to say, I do enjoy the performances, but it is just lets itself down. It just shoots itself in the foot. It's got this kind of no-nonsense, hardcore, grungy kind of soundtrack. It's not full metal, it's not full rock, but it's just sort of pulsy enough that it sort of sets the hackles on your back up. But at the end of the day, I think that it's not a good time, although I do think there's some things in it that are fairly entertaining. So I think this is okay. I think I'm going to come in at 2.5 stars on this, because I did like quite a lot of it. I found found the scenes that in your average horror film I'd find fairly dull, the sort of stuff that you have to get through to get to the fun stuff. I found that more enjoyable than the actual meat of this film, I have to say. I didn't think the horror was well handled in it. I think some of the more flinchy scenes, they are what they are. I think some of the performances tip over into very over the top territory, but I do think it's got some things to recommend it. So I'd say check this out, give it a shot, but probably don't expect anything too much.
So, what's going on down at West Beach?
Well, we got a bit of a fish problem. Tons of dead ones were rolling up on the shore.
How many?
Hard to tell. Maybe 9 or 10.
9 or 10 what? Fish?
Tons. 9 or 10 tons.
So next up on the list we have a film called The Block Island Sound, released on the 12th of March to Netflix. This is written, directed and produced by the McManus brothers, Kevin and Matthew McManus. So initially at first we see that there are huge numbers of fish being washed up dead on the shores of Block Island, this small isolated sort of fishing village. We follow a group of characters coming together, a sort of family reunion, to investigate these strange goings on. The family get together. There seems to be something up with the father, Tom. It seems also that something is affecting the wildlife. It's not just the fish that are all dying en masse. Birds are falling out of the sky dead. As more and more of these increasingly strange events take place, Tom goes missing. He appears to be dead. Police are called in to investigate, but they don't seem to suspect any foul play, whereas his nephew, Harry, instantly thinks that something strange is happening, and he starts to be plagued by these bizarre visions. He starts to hear this strange sound, and he spirals into this paranoid quest for answers as he tries to find out what happened to his beloved uncle, whilst as he does so begins to grow increasingly violent, increasingly unpredictable, and he eventually ends up putting the rest of his family at risk. So straight away I have to say that this is very nicely shot. We get these interesting shots of the sea, we get a strong sense of atmosphere. The music is exceptional. The music is composed by Paul Koch. It creates a sort of propulsive driving force, not unlike the soundtrack in Sicario by Johan Johansson. It's interesting to note how a really good score can elevate something that would otherwise be fairly forgettable. A lot of the camera work is interesting, it's fluid, it creates a sense of moving towards something that parallels Harry's own search for answers as he's drawn towards increasingly bizarre and outlandish conclusions which he himself has to question, despite evidence that would suggest that something very, very strange is happening. And it must be said that the Block Island Sound plays with some very unusual ideas. There is a sense of menace and dread throughout, as I mentioned, which are created largely through sound and music and camera work. However, I do have to say that I found this to be quite a chore to sit through. The incidents, when they do happen, are of the sort that can be quite easily explained away, that seem to suggest that something strange is happening, but pretty soon we get the feeling that we're not actually watching something that's unfolding in a horror landscape, but something far more prosaic, something that's dealing with far more easily relatable issues, things that aren't particularly unique or that unusual. We do get moments of atmosphere, things that seem quite disturbing, quite visually striking, but ultimately it all comes down to Harry's own quest for answers, and I have to say Harry is an intensely unlikable character, as is basically everybody else in this film. I think everyone in this film is a selfish asshole, and I don't care for any of them. I've no interest in any of these characters. I find most of them despicable, a lot of times given over to arguing, these scenes of sort of squabbles breaking out that I think have plagued a lot of horror in recent years, that a lot of writers and directors seem to confuse as subtext. These scenes of sort of families breaking down, of social collapse, of arguments between these sort of upper middle class family members seem to be what writers are bringing in to infuse their material with some sense of worth. Pretty much all of the semi-supernatural / unexplained events are of the sort that can be explained by mental illness. Now, mental illness is a subject that crops up in a lot of horror films these days. It seems to be a pressing concern. I understand the need on one level to deal with material like this. I understand that it does have a place. However, I happen to think that it's becoming an increasingly cheap trick to bring in these scenes that elevate material that otherwise would be incredibly dull, incredibly uninteresting, and would barely qualify for inclusion in the horror genre as a whole. Now, I'm not gatekeeping the horror genre. I'm not saying what you can and what you can't have, but I have to say that if you cut out all the scenes in this that are dreams or hallucinations or manifestations of things that are going on in one character's mind, you would basically have scenes of arguing and not much else. It's very dreary. A lot of it seems to involve either arguments or one character sitting sort of staring off into the distance. Beyond this really nice propulsive score, I don't think there's much internal drive to anything that's going on. I think it's quite dull. And once again, a lot of this I think comes down to the fact that the writers here in this instance seem to think that writing realistic, believable characters mean people that swear every second word. There's so much profanity in this is pretty incredible. I never think that excessive swearing is a substitute for realism. I think a lot of the characters are just bottom of the barrel scum, and that the confusion with lowest common denominator characters and dialogue and things that are relatable or believable is a common misstep in a lot of films these days. A lot of writing these days seems to make this mistake. One of the main concerns of this particular film is conspiracy theories and the sort of people that believe in conspiracy theories. And now Harry starts off as someone who's fairly credulous. He's got a friend, Dale, who is basically one of the tinfoil hat brigade who believes everything. He also swears incessantly to the point of absurd cliche. And the interesting thing is that this is a film that's dealing with a fairly outlandish central concept, but at the same time it feels the need to lampshade its own conspiracy paranoia and point to it and say, okay, the character doesn't believe what these characters are saying is likely to happen because it's so ridiculous, because these are the sort of people who immediately jump to paranoid conclusions. But at the same time, he ultimately finds himself thinking, okay, what if what these crazy people are saying to me is true? And that journey of coming to understand what these characters are saying is played out in a fairly uninteresting fashion. I don't think any of the characters particularly grow. I think they just sort of descend into worse versions of themselves. It does have some potentially interesting ideas, but I think they are thrown away by the fact that the main focus of this is these incredibly uninteresting social interactions between a lot of the characters. There are moments that kind of stand out that are fairly memorable that I have to say I was quite impressed by. However, at the same time, they are let down by some fairly terrible special effects scenes, which actually surprised me because for the most part this does look quite good. It is shot well. It does have a very kind of dreary, colourless, washed out palette that I suppose you could argue on an intellectual level is meant to parallel the character's own descent into a mental fugue. But at the end of the day, it just creates something that doesn't look attractive at all, even though there are moments which reveal quite an interesting feel for what they're doing. There's one point in which one character gives a speech which is basically meant to be the okay, here's what this film is actually about speech. It's fairly on the nose, it's fairly basic when it happens, and you kind of go, okay, I see what you're doing there. It's forgivable, I suppose, but then the problem is they go and then they replay this exact speech at the very end of the film as though to say, okay, if you didn't get it the first time round, this incredibly heavy-handed here's what's happening speech, here it is again, just so there's no doubt. And interestingly, for a film that kind of plays with the is this real, is this all in his head throughout a lot of the film, it then it feels the need to really hit you over the head with it at the end and say, okay, here you go, this is exactly what is happening. And it does feel kind of insulting, it feels basic. I don't know if this was maybe something that was added at a later stage to bring some kind of clarity, but I think the events that we see don't have as much ambiguity as perhaps the inclusion of this voiceover would suggest it needed or it had. So this really isn't the kind of film that I care for at all, although it does have, again, just enough interesting ideas in it that I find myself thinking back on it. It does have a very good soundtrack. I think the soundtrack is exceptional, but it just isn't worth it. It's 99 minutes long, which feels very long for what we get. It's a film where the writers obviously have fallen in love with the characters and their own dilemmas, but the problem is we as an audience don't care for any of these characters. I don't think enough effort is made into creating an interesting dilemma for the characters other than this very obvious descent for the lead character. which once again is conveyed to us in characters basically explaining to us who they are. Harry himself at one point is described as somebody who refuses to believe the simplest answers. Again, very on the nose. Fair enough, it is forgivable, but I just think that you needed something more interesting, something more unusual, something that played more to the paranoia and events that are going on around the characters, which are far more interesting than what is going on in Harry's own psychology. I have to say that this is a Netflix release. I have to say I don't think that Netflix has been doing too well in terms of original horror releases of late. Things that they've picked up haven't been really worthy of note for a long time. I think the last really good film that Netflix released was The Platform, which actually turned out to be my favourite film of last year. This definitely is kind of forgettable. I just wish that Netflix would really step up their game and put more effort into acquiring good horror titles. I don't know whether or not that the horror titles are just not performing well on Netflix and that's why they haven't put the effort into pickups. They seem to be a lot more focused on developing their own series. That seems to be where the money lies for them. But I think if they got more original horror pickups, then it would attract more subscribers to their platform. There's so many others out there. Shudder, of course, the big one. And now we've got the Arrow Player, which is released, which I think has got a fantastic range of titles. I don't think Netflix is really doing a good job at all at the moment, but I will keep an eye out and see what they release for the rest of the year. I think the Block Island Sound ultimately is pretty forgettable. It's got some nice sort of moments. It is heavily flawed though, which means that I think I'm going to have to come in at a 2 stars for the Block Island Sound. I wouldn't recommend it. I can see it might appeal to some people. It's got quite a nice restrained kind of feel. It doesn't feel the need to go all out, but I just think it's far too interested in melodrama and not interested enough in delivering what it ultimately does deliver, but in very, very small amounts. I think it's much too long, but that said, length is relative. A film that's very good, that's long, can fly past. A film that's really shit, that's only about 70 minutes long, can seem like it takes an eternity. 99 minutes for this, I have to say, is too long. I thought it dragged in a lot of places. I don't necessarily think this would be better if it was cut short. I think there's just not enough that I can really salvage to make it worthwhile, other than a sort of a ground-up rewrite, starting with the sort of the images towards the end, the more interesting premises, and kind of do away with a lot of the psychodrama of it all, because I don't think that's particularly interesting. I don't think it's unique. I think it's been played out far too much in the horror genre. I'm far more interested in seeing things that are unique and interesting rather than more squalid characters squabbling at each other that I don't give a shit about. So the Block Island Sound, I would, if you're a soundtrack lover, I'd check out the soundtrack because I think it stands out as being head and shoulders above the rest of the film. But I would say stay away from the Block Island Sound, because the Block Island Sound for me is...
Have you ever had any difficulty getting to sleep or staying asleep?
Lately, yes.
Okay. Do you drink coffee, tea, or any other caffeinated beverages? And if so, how many per day?
Coffee. Usually I'll have about 3 to 6 cups a day.
Okay. Have you ever been diagnosed with any sleeping disorders? Sleepwalking, night terrors, insomnia?
No. Not officially. I used to sleepwalk as a kid, but I haven't in years.
Okay.
So next up we have the Canadian film Come True, released on the 12th of March. This is an IFC midnight release, written and directed by Anthony Scott Burns, who's done 1 or 2 things before. I can't honestly say anything. I've seen the film Our House that came out a few years back, a segment in the anthology Holidays. So Come True follows a teenage runaway, Sarah Dunn, played by Julia Sarah Stone, who's having these really strange dreams, and she gets involved in a groundbreaking sleep study experiment where events take an increasingly dark tone. Now, I don't particularly want to get too much into the plot of Come True. It's not particularly narrative focused. I have to say I didn't know too much about this going into it. I did see that it was getting some fairly decent reviews all around, but I think if I had to just sum up Come True in one word, that word would be wow. because this film just blew me away. I was really not expecting this at all whatsoever. And I have to say, from the very first frame of Come True, I was completely captivated. It's a completely unique experience, unlike anything I've ever seen before. It's a really simple premise. It's playing with dreams, which are something universal. Dreams have always been a fascinating thing to explore. Films like A Nightmare on Elm Street or Inception that really make a great use of that fact, because dreams are something universal that we all experience, but something that we don't necessarily understand fully. There's always the potential to explore interesting ideas when you're playing within a dreamscape. And I have to say that the dreamscapes in Come True are just fantastic. They're so incredibly visually stunning that you find yourself really waiting to see the next one. They're so involving and so incredibly stunning. They create this kind of unique, immersive, almost like a piece of art when you're in it, that at once is sort of beautiful and terrifying at the same time. One of the things that really struck me about Come True is that I'm somebody that's watched an awful lot of horror films. The last film that I think ever truly scared me as an adult was The Blair Witch Project. There are very few films that I can think of that I could honestly say have scared me. In the last sort of 20 years or so, the trends tend to be you get your fairly kind of mainstream, quiet bang sort of ghost films that tend to be about allegory and sort of social metaphors and things where it's more about creating a sense of dread and things that are intellectually disturbing to us as, you know, enlightened viewers. Or you get torture porn where it's all about human suffering and it's about the visuals and it's about gore and it's about imagining unspeakably gruesome acts being inflicted on the human body. Now, Come True is a film that has almost no gore whatsoever in it, but I have to say it is, I think, one of the few films I can ever think of that has truly, genuinely scared me as an adult. And that's not something I say lightly at all. I don't go into horror films expecting to watch something scary. To an extent, you could say I'm jaded. I know the tricks. I know how it works. I see something and I immediately think of, okay, this is a cinematic quotation from this horror film. It seems quite mechanical in general when you watch it, but you can still go along with it because you're willing to go along for the ride. Now, Come True does things, just really, really unique things that I've never seen done before. It doesn't need to rely on big setups. It doesn't rely on jump scares, gore. In the sheer power of its imagery and its direction, it creates this world where everything feels incredibly on edge. There's an ominous kind of sense of dread throughout the whole movie, where you feel, because the lead character, Julia Sarah Stone's character Sarah, is incredibly young looking. I think the actress is 24, 25. But she's playing a character that's much younger, and she's incredibly young and fragile looking, and she's run away from home. She's an isolated character. She's very small. She's getting involved with things she doesn't understand, and the vistas in her dreams are these huge, really surreal, unfathomable things that create this sense of almost Lovecraftian dread when you see them. But at the same time, it's impossible to really comprehend what you're seeing. You're not seeing things that are objectively scary. You're seeing things that are scary because they're hard to process, they're difficult to understand. And that inability to understand something is what can be truly terrifying about nightmares, because you are not in control of anything that's going on. And Sarah is such a young, fragile character that you get the sense that she's pitted up against the entirety of her subconscious. You get the feeling that she's totally unequipped to deal with anything that's happening to her. She's really small. The film's very icy, very cold, very emotionless, and it just creates this sense of isolation and dread that is genuinely unparalleled. I mean, I feel like I could gush about this film for hours, and I don't necessarily know if I could do it justice, because I think that the best way to watch it is just to go in like I did, not really knowing anything at all, and just to be blown away by what you're seeing. But I have to say, and I don't say this lightly, that this is without doubt one of the scariest films that I've ever seen. The imagery is so memorable, the music is just beautifully, compellingly dark. Interestingly enough, the music is actually performed by Electric Youth, who are this Canadian double act, and Pilot Priest, which is the name that writer-director Anthony Scott Burns uses for releasing his own music. So Anthony Scott Burns is actually, as well as writing and directing, co-writing the music, which is interesting because music is such an integral part of a film. And a film like this, where it's all about textures and images and just a general experience, music is absolutely vital. And the music in this is really creates this immensely horrifying, overwhelming landscape where we, as an audience, feel incredibly incredibly small, and that the things that we're seeing are so huge that we can barely even comprehend them. Now, this is, of course, a Canadian horror film, and I have to say that I adore Canadian horror films. They've always had something really unique, really interesting about them that feels different to any other country's output, genuinely. There's always a sense of, there's this very kind of icy, cold, sort of emotionally withdrawn feeling, where we're not seeing characters act out these huge histrionic emotional scenes. Everything's quite buttoned down, but beautifully shot at the same time. There's a sort of a cool palette to what we're seeing, exemplified in the works of David Cronenberg, the most famous Canadian director. I have seen reviews that suggest that this is a Cronenbergian film. I don't think this is particularly a Cronenbergian film. I think it's got a really special voice to it that's unlike anything I've ever seen before. I really just can't explain how much this kind of got under my skin. And the interesting thing is, it doesn't get under your skin with its situation as such. It's not a film that's, the scares in it are something that's immediately apparent on paper. They aren't ideas that instill dread on you reading about them or thinking about them objectively. But when you're immersed in the film, and I suggest that the best way to watch this is on your own in the dark with all the lights off. When you're immersed in the film and seeing all this and just experiencing it just on this absolutely visceral level where your brain is more or less switched off and you're just reacting to what you're seeing, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean you need to switch your brain off to appreciate it, because this is not just a stupid mechanical film. It's a film that plays to our fears on a gut level, because the things that we're seeing are so huge and disturbing, and they're the sort of things that I imagine it was difficult planning out conceptually, because they managed to be consistently surprising and unnerving in a surreal fashion that really gets under your skin and makes you think about what you're seeing, which I think is fantastic. Because if you can scare an audience without having to rely on these hugely scripted, immensely sort of stage-managed fright sequences, if you can manage to scare an audience on a purely visceral level with images and music alone, then that is pure cinema. That's what film is invented for, to create something that would not work on the page. It does not work conveyed to you conceptually. It's something you have to experience on a visceral level, and I think Come True does that in a way like no other film I've ever seen before. It's just a beautifully directed film. I think the acting in it throughout is pretty exceptional. It really just comes down to these beautifully artistically rendered dream sequences that are disturbing, and they build up and they get under your skin in a way that makes you dread the next one eventually. The ideas in it are really interesting. They're really simple, but at the same time, it's not something I've ever seen before. But like all good films, they are conceptually very light. There's not a load of pseudoscientific baggage that you have to get in these huge, dense explanations. The plot can really be conveyed in a few words. There's not that much dialogue in it throughout. The acting is very naturalistic, and it just manages to create this world where everything is simple, and it just hits us almost on a kind of subconscious level where we can't fully process why what we're seeing is scary, but the scares in it do not play to obvious things that we've seen before. Interestingly, there are references to other things in it. There's a room 237 mentioned in it, which is of course a callback to The Shining. The characters at one point watch Night of the Living Dead, one of the most famous public domain horror films, in a cinema. The character wears a Romero t-shirt at one point, and the lead doctor in it, his look, his character seems to have been designed to look like George Romero, which is interesting because there are no, beyond the sort of superficial surface level things like that, there's no cinematic quotations don't inform the film in any way. It's not a film that owes a great debt to these films other than the fact that these are exemplary horror films from the past. I have to say that this is one of those films that just goes to show you that you can still be scared by something very simple. It doesn't have to have all this baggage. It doesn't have to have huge, heavy-handed, allegorical significance. It doesn't need to play to, okay, these are social issues that we're feeling right now. Here's a horror film that's a clever metaphor to these that the critics go, ah, yeah, that's very clever. You can just scare someone with images, and I think the images in this are so incredibly powerful that they carry the entire film, even though it has to be said that the direction throughout is beautiful. All the non-dream scenes carry the weight of these incredibly sort of ominous and disturbing dream sequences. There's a constant sense of moving forwards, like we're rushing towards something that's going to be genuinely shocking when we get to it. But the best thing is, it never bursts the tension with obvious kind of jump scares. It never relieves the tension in a way that makes the audience feel happy. It constantly throughout, it's just a slow building, rising sense of fear and dread, and I think that's really fascinating. I think it's such a dying art. I think this is absolutely a case where simplicity is played to its utmost. I think it's a very, very Canadian film, which I think is fantastic. I think Anthony Scott Burns genuinely from this is a fantastic, fantastic director. I will watch anything he ever does because I think this is absolutely fantastic because it scared me. And now that's not necessarily something that easily translates into why I think this film is so good, because fear is of course a very personal thing, but I think that on an intellectual level, I can justify why I think it's scary, because the fears come back to this very primal thing and our ability to be overwhelmed by things that are going on in our subconscious. We get the sense that Sarah is fearful of falling asleep, which is something, again, that's a kind of Nightmare on Elm Street staple, where the idea that something going on in your subconscious is something hiding within your dreams is disturbing you, there's something incredibly scary lurking in your dreams, is such a powerful concept, because sleep, dreams, this is how our body recharges, this is our safe spot, and when our one refuge from the horrors of the real world is infested with these incredibly disturbing images, then it's such a powerful idea, it's so unsettling, and it manages to rise to this pinnacle of gut level fear that I think is, I would honestly say, and this sounds ridiculous hyperbole, I have to say that just on a purely instinctual level, this is the scariest film of the 2000s without doubt. It's being released on physical media, Blu-ray, just very shortly, just at the start of April. I will absolutely be getting this when it comes out. I can't wait to watch it again. And I think it's one of those films that it's such a visual journey that it's going to work watching it again and again. I think it's got replayability. I don't know if it will necessarily maintain that ability to scare, but I think that the world that it creates is so disturbing. I think the images are so unique. They're the sort of thing you will not get anywhere else. And it is easily a film that I'm going to give 5 stars out of 5. I have to say, I do have one slight word of caution, which is the end is unusual. The very, very end, I think the climax, the sort of the end of the third act is wonderful, but there's a sort of a little coda at the end that in all the reviews that I've read has been very, very divisive. I think it does work. I have to say, I'd have probably rather it wasn't there. Just this slight thing at the end that sort of makes you think, I kind of wish you hadn't put that there, but at the same time, I've enjoyed, 100 minutes of this genuinely disturbing, gut-churning nightmare. I think it's the truest manifestation of a nightmare on screen that I've ever seen. I've never, ever seen a film that's played nightmares as well as this. Nightmare on Elm Street doesn't come close. All those nightmares feel very staged and obvious and within this sort of horror film tradition. I have to say, I think it would be absolutely incredible to try and do a Nightmare on Elm Street with these kind of visuals, where if you took something with this kind of sense of fear and something very disturbing where the characters don't feel safe at any time, I think this would be phenomenal if they took this really realistic, disturbing, surreal approach and made a Nightmare on Elm Street film where it's not about the jokes, it's not about the wisecracks. I know that's not what people go into Nightmare on Elm Street for, but the sense of fear and scariness in this is unparalleled, and I think doing perhaps a Nightmare on Elm Street reboot or a remake or whatever, taking this sort of approach would be interesting. I'm not saying it would necessarily be great. I can see why it wouldn't work, but I think just the imagery in this and the ideas I would love to see in that context. There's a slight reservation in my head. I don't know if I'd give this maybe like a 9.5 or a 10 out of 10. I can't honestly say. It's definitely 5 stars, not 4.5. But I think for something to get through to me, I consider, I'd say I'm a jaded horror fan. I love horror. I do feel like I've seen a lot of it before, and I feel like watching new films, it tends to be something that I can relate to other things within the genre. There's a rich tradition of films that get quoted from constantly. But I think for something that's got through to me like this and made me feel the way I feel, this is absolutely, without doubt, a 5 out of 5. It's the best film I've seen this year so far. It's easily got a chance of being my favourite film of the year. I think it's going to take something quite incredible to beat this, because as I've said, I don't think I've been scared as an adult for at least 10 years in any horror film. I've been sickened, I've been mildly intellectually disturbed, but I've never been truly scared on a gut level. And for that, I have to say, you need to give Come True a chance. It is amazing.
Is that a book of spells?
No, I think it's stories. Listen to this. Remedies prescribed for those who by prestigatory art have lost their virile members.
Is prestidity thingy ye old English for shagging?
I think it's like magic tricks or something like that.
With their virile members. That sounds sexy.
So let's go on to a film that goes by the name of The Heiress next. This is a British film released on the 15th of March, written and directed by Chris Bell. It follows two sisters, Claire and Anna, who are brought together by the death of their grandmother. It turns out that whilst suffering from emotional issues, Claire suddenly finds herself having these bizarre fits and visions. Her dreams are troubled by unusual spectres, including a young masked child and an older woman. We follow Claire as she is plagued by these visions, and she finds herself drawn further and further away from her family, isolated by her own deteriorating mental health, and ultimately she has to decide whether what she's seeing is real or whether she really is a lot worse off than she thought. Now, this is once again a plot that we've seen quite a lot of, definitely nothing new. I have to say that right away, The Heiress is an awful lot better than I expected it to be. I think the fact it's British helps it. The look of the film is a very kind of washed out, urban, working class sort of British drama kind of feel to it. It's directed by Chris Bell, who also stars in it as a very despicable character by the name of Brad. Chris Bell is somebody that's sort of been around the London kind of geezer film. He's directed some other films before. He has a lot more acting credits to his name. I think he does a pretty good job in this for the most part, both directing and acting and of course writing, although there are 3 other writers also credited for this, all of whom are producers. The success of a film like this comes down to a few issues. One of them is how committed it is to dealing with the subjects it's bringing up. When you're getting a film that's dealing with mental health, inevitably the road that you go is that you suggest that what's happening could either be happening in the character's mind or it could actually be happening for real. A lot of films lately tend to play up the ambiguity of this and give us no concrete answers one way or another. I think for a horror film it can often be quite cheap if we're seeing a lot of visions of things happening and then it turns out to be all in the character's psyches. It's a fairly overplayed trope at this point. Another factor is, do we care for the lead character? And in this case, the answer is very much yes. Claire is played by Candice Nergard. I think I've probably pronounced that wrongly, but she is very likeable, very down-to-earth, believable character. I think she has a really good relationship with the other characters. I think the familial connection that we see on screen feels very realistic. It feels rooted in believable family interactions. I think Candice Nergard is an excellent actress. I think she really brings a lot of empathy to this part. Something that we tend to see a lot of in films dealing with mental health, like The Block Island Sound, for example, is that we tend to have characters that feel very unlikable. We can't necessarily feel for their plight. I didn't for one second find myself feeling sorry for the character in The Block Island Sound, whereas in The Heiress, because she's such a likeable character, because she has these very established relationships with people that care for her, it feels very depressing when we see her deterioration over the course of the film. It does work itself into very kind of unsettling, depressing territory at times. A lot of it is character interaction, character drama, punctuated by these dreams and visions and bizarre things, as Claire is troubled by flashbacks of things that have happened in her bloodline. She's getting flashbacks of her past, she's getting flashbacks of her grandmother. There's a real kind of rumbling, brooding sense of menace throughout, though. I think the characters feel very fragile and very vulnerable in this, which I think is good. I think it plays up just how terrifying this is. I think everything around her seems very rational, very realistic. I found myself genuinely quite emotionally invested in this story. All the characters have got sort of Essex, Cockney kind of accents. I think that lends it a certain sense of realism. I don't think things are glamorized or pushed into these ridiculous emotional confrontation scenes. I think her descent is very tragic and very believable. I think there's just enough horror aspects peppered throughout to keep it going. I think Chris Bell does a nice job of directing. He does occasionally lapse into sort of roaming, slightly unstable, presume handheld camera for some shots that I think is perhaps less successful. One of the things I found most surprising about it is that it actually has a religious character, Father John, who Claire goes to just seek help. And I was surprised by the fact that this character was actually portrayed in a good light for once, because I find that not just in horror films, but in a lot of films these days, I think that the church and religion tends to be demonized. It tends to be something that's pointed out as a corrupt institution. And I think that was pretty nice. I am not myself religious, but I do understand the appeal of religion. I understand its place as imparting a series of moral guidelines by which to live your life. I like the idea of the church as a saviour. But for the most part, I found myself really carried along by the acting in this. I think the atmosphere is really good. I think Chris Bell actually is pretty fun as this utterly despicable, caricaturized, Cockney geezer, laddish character. And for the most part, I just found myself pleasantly surprised that this was just a good, solid film with a surprising amount of emotional depth to it, which is why I think that I'm going to give the Heiress 3 stars out of 5. I did enjoy it. It doesn't really rise to any great heights of kind of atmosphere or things that we've never seen before. It does have a nice atmosphere, but it's a very oppressive, heavy kind of atmosphere. I think the acting's fantastic, and I think the acting conveys exactly what it needs to convey without lapsing into a word bait. I think that even low-budget films can be plagued by people feeling the need to infuse their characters with as many tics and pump up their characterization to ridiculous absurds. I think I really enjoy seeing something like this that's underplayed by people that seem convincing. It's got a nice soundtrack. It's very tragic and very depressing at the end. It's kind of unsettling throughout. Overall, I just would say that The Heiress is another solid, very low-budget British film. Surprisingly good. I enjoyed it quite a lot.
We hire the top thread count consultants, the best stitching specialists, the cotton masters from across the planet to bring you the latest in our denim revolution, the Super Shapers! Jeans that automatically adapt to your body size. The first ever gender-inclusive jeans! One shape for all! One shape for all! One shape for all!
Let's move on to Slaxx now, S-L-A-X-X. Now, Slaxx is a Canadian film. It was released on the 18th of March to Shudder, and it concerns a young girl by the name of Libby, who is just starting out. She's on her first day at a trendy clothing store. She, along with a range of other staff members, are working overnight. They're shut in this store. They have to dress it all up for a Monday Madness super sale event. They have to get everything ready, and the latest product on the market is the Super Shaper, which is an especially attractive pair of new jeans made with revolutionary new technology in them, which shapes them to the form of the wearer. And naturally, of course, there's a lot of build-up around this new product, but unbeknownst to them, there is a killer in their midst, and that killer just happens to be a possessed pair of jeans. Now, this is a film that continues in a long line of tradition of, I don't know if there's particularly a name for it, but I suppose you'd call them killer object films. In the past, we've had such things as Killer Sofa, fairly self-explanatory. We've had Blades, the film about a killer lawnmower. We've had Rubber, the film about a killer tire. The idea is that the horror genre has done so much, it's explored so many different avenues, that you take something with a basically ridiculous premise and play it through. There are two ways you can either do this. One is to do it basically as a straight-out spoof, upping the ridiculousness of it. I suppose you could throw in something like Jack Frost in there about a killer snowman. where just the sheer incongruity of what you're seeing works and sort of drives a lot of the film, or else you can play it a lot more seriously. Now I have to say, for a film about a killer pair of trousers, Slaxx plays it pretty straight for the most part, but at the same time in other places it really kind of ups the black comedy. I wouldn't necessarily consider this a comedy as such, for a lot of reasons which I will get into. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is a Canadian film, and again, as I mentioned earlier, I adore Canadian films. I have to say I had an absolute blast with Slaxx. I think it is hands down the best killer trouser film I've ever seen. I was kind of expecting something fun and sort of throwaway, probably, you know, quite humorous, quite gory, but the thing I wasn't necessarily expecting was that Slaxx is actually what I would consider a film with a message. It's got something to say which is unusual. It's this really sharp, kind of gleeful, surprisingly committed black comedy. It's a satire of these vacuous, virtue-signalling, corporate, hypocritical types. It plays its satire incredibly well. It takes shots at every aspect of modern consumerist lifestyle in a way that doesn't necessarily feel didactic or heavy-handed. It remains playful throughout, but at the same time it's got a real kind of cutting edge to it, which is surprising. The effects in it are really cool, a lot of them done practically, which is interesting. We get to see some little snippets of behind-the-scenes shots of the trouser puppeting, which I think is pretty interesting. I think if you're making a film about this sort of subject matter, about something very outlandish and very crazy like killer jeans, you need to have confidence that you can effectively realise what you're imagining. And I think in this particular case that the visuals are really cool, the visuals are interesting, and I think within reason every possible way of killing somebody with a pair of trousers is utilised in this. I think there's a certain goofiness to the premise, but at the same time I think it's superseded by the film's incredibly biting attacks on corporate trendiness. Now, the interesting thing is, there was a lot of talk about the Wrong Turn remake or reboot or whatever you want to call it that came out earlier this year. A lot of people were saying, oh, it's a woke film because the cast were very racially and sexually diverse. Some people said it was, you know, a critique of these people. Other people said, no, it is just a woke film. Now, I have to say, I didn't find Wrong Turn to be in any way critical of wokeness. I didn't feel it to be embracing of it either. But I think Slaxx is definitely a film that is making a conscious effort to ridicule these people. And I think that's great, because I think humanity has never been at a point more deserving of ridicule than it is now. The characters are punched up to ludicrous absurds, but at the same time, they do ring true. Because I feel like a lot of the people that we'd see in this film in real life are utterly insincere, completely ludicrous caricatures of humanity at its very worst. There's loads of great stuff in it that I think is really funny. I think even the characters that you hate in it, and there definitely are more than its fair share of pretty hateable characters. There's an evil boss, there's vacuous kind of backbiting employees, there's a social media influencer who's shown as incredibly catty, sort of diva, who ultimately comes to a very sticky end. I think everyone in this, basically, with the exception of the lead girl, Libby, played by Romaine Dennis, I think everyone in it gets their fair share of flack. I think everybody has jabs taken at them. I don't think any of these characters are meant to be likeable, but at the same time, I think the satire is so pointed and so interesting that it works. It's unusually clever for what it is. I think there's actually quite a lot of moments that come across as quite chilling, which you wouldn't necessarily think. I mean, on paper, some of the ideas, they are silly. The handling of a lot of the images do come with a certain bravado. They do poke fun at themselves in some points. There's a dance scene that's, borders on ludicrous, but ultimately comes to be fairly integral to the narrative of the film. I think even though it does embrace that in points, it's also not afraid to make us think. It is, of course, very critical of clothing manufacturers that employ less than humanitarian business practices. I think a film about killer trousers is going to appeal to perhaps a more limited subset of the horror audience than you might think. I think the idea has got a certain ludicrousness inherent in it. I have to say, I think that if you are put off by this concept, if you think it sounds too jokey or too silly, then I definitely give this a go. I think it's got enough gleeful gore in it to appeal to somebody that that would like the idea of a film about killer trousers, and at the same time I think there's enough full-blooded satire in it that you can really enjoy it if you would be normally put off by this idea. I have to say, I think the fact it's Canadian works very well in its favour. It feels very Canadian in that it's not afraid to interrogate a lot of the problems inherent in globalised industry that I think maybe an American film might shy away from. I think it definitely follows through in its ideas. At one point there was a fear I had that it might be kind of backing down a little bit, but it commits to its message. I think message films do kind of put people off sometimes, but I happen to like them as long as they tie more into bigger issues like this as opposed to the politics of the personal that I think a lot of movies get bogged down in these days. There's definitely moments where it feels the need to push its characters into over-the-top villainy than is absolutely necessary. I think there's one moment, one of the characters who's kind of set out as the main villain does something that feels a little bit lazy, but I have to say for the most part I really like the characters because they're these grotesque parodies of these virtue signalling, platitude spouting scum. I really hate this sort of person, and I think it's great to see them tackled in such an interesting film. I think Libby is a good heroine. She's basically set out as the moral kind of final girl in that she's an outsider. She's coming into this world bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So the company is called the CCC. They make a great deal of touting how ethical their company is and how much good they're doing for the world in general, and she obviously believes all the hype, and it's nice to see the scales falling from her eyes as she sees big business for what it really is. It's definitely not preachy. It never loses sight of its need to explore the limits of its ideas. It's also incredibly funny throughout. I definitely was laughing out loud quite a lot in this. I think it's great. The dialogue is very grotesque and very funny. It commits to the full sort of skin-crawling horrors of these people. Alongside Libby, the other main character in it is Shruti, played by Sahara Bojani, who I think does a very good job. She's the one person amidst all these acidic, corporate, soulless employees. She's the one who we see as still holding on to some vestiges of her own self-identity, which I think is interesting, even though she sort of comes across as quite prickly and like she really doesn't give a shit about anything. I think she's probably the most interesting character in it, although it's not necessarily a film about characters undergoing a journey as obviously a film making a bigger point. And I think that's interesting because we saw Lucky, which was the first Shudder release of the month, which was a film that obviously had a huge message to it, and I think this is a much better film at handling a message and putting its point across because it remembers to have fun with it. It remembers to be gleeful and bloody and over the top, whereas I think Lucky, because it was playing with issues that are less easily parodyable, ended up feeling a lot more heavy-handed, a lot more inelegant in its satire, although it wasn't particularly what I'd call a satire. It was more a film that was dealing with a message in quite a serious way. I think that satire is obviously the best way to deal with something heavy like this. I think the issues it's dealing with are they're things that I personally feel quite strongly about, although I don't think that my own politics particularly flavoured my enjoyment of it. I think you can still enjoy it a lot, no matter where you come on it, ultimately. It's written and directed by Elsa Kephart, who is Canadian, of course. One of the things I think is quite unusual is that this is the first feature-length film she's directed in nearly 20 years. She directed a movie, sort of festival darling, that went by the name of Graveyard Alive, which came out in 2003. By all accounts, not incredibly well known, but it did seem to do quite well for itself. She's done a few shorts since then, she's done some other work, but I think she's somebody that's got a very interesting directorial style. I think this is a great film. I think it displays a real love for texture and old school VFX. I think the performances are all played out in a wonderful style. It really comes together as a nice whole. It does bounce about from sort of set pieces occasionally, but it never really loses sight of what it wants to say. I think the images in it are fantastic. It's also 77 minutes long, which I think is great. It definitely does not overstay its welcome whatsoever. It's nice and short and committed to doing what it wants to do. So I think I have to say this is without doubt the best Shudder film of the month. Personally, I'd actually say it's my favourite Shudder release of the year so far. I think it's a really great film. There's perhaps certain similarities to Peter Strickland's In Fabric, although that was a film more interested in style and atmosphere, perhaps, rather than the message to this film, this sort of underlying drive for the story, which I think is one of the things that makes Slaxx interesting, because it's able to deal with this message in quite a light and interesting way. I just enjoyed it immensely, which is why I think I'm going to have to come in at 4.5 stars for Slaxx. I thought it was fantastic. I think it's really, really fun and really enjoyable, and I would urge you to check it out. It's absolutely the best thing Shudder's put out this month, and one of the best films of the month. Another Canadian triumph.
It's funny, after so many years of experimentation, the solution is so simple. Target the receptors in the brain by a homemade cocktail designed by me that allows us to extract the sensation known as fear into an easily contained gas.
So next up we have Phobias, an anthology film that follows 5 dangerous patients taken to an experimental test facility where a crazed scientist attempts to weaponize their fears. Now, the format of this anthology is that it takes 5 separate stories, each ostensibly dealing with fears, and dovetails them into this central storyline called Outpost 37, where we see the characters from the various anthology segments interact. Now, I think the format of this is fairly interesting. It starts off straight away with one of the stories, and then at the end of the story we see the lead character being taken to Outpost 37, then we see all the other characters, and then it goes one by one to each of them, does their story, and then goes back to the framework story for it all. Now, this isn't something I've particularly seen done before. I think it's quite interesting, but I have to say that the connective tissue between each of the segments is fairly limited. I don't feel like a lot of these stories feel as if they've been conceived solely for inclusion in this anthology. They feel like just random shorts that have been cobbled together, and then this framework's been put around them in an attempt to sort of create something cohesive and whole. Because the main issue is, for a film called Phobias, I can't honestly say that any of these films particularly deal with phobias of any kind. Definitely not obvious things. I suppose to a lesser extent you could argue that they deal with fears of some description. I think if Phobias was to work, you'd have to start off with a very clear knowledge of what exactly you're doing, which is making an anthology film about phobias. Think about the overall connective story, and then feed it back into stories that are very distinct, that serve the purposes of this greater story. I think in the sense that they deal with particular issues or problems, you could argue that they're all tied into fears, in the sense that there are hundreds and hundreds of different bizarre, weird phobias out there, the names of which you probably don't know, bizarre things that probably are so strange to us that they probably only affect a minute portion of humanity. I have to say that the choice of phobias to deal with in this particular story tends to suggest that not all of these segments were conceived explicitly for inclusion in this story, and that they might have just been writers and directors deciding to tell whatever stories they wanted and then vaguely tailoring them to the needs of this film. So straight away, I have to say that I don't think any of these anthology segments particularly even feel finished. It almost feels like a cobbling together of unfinished short films that then kind of dovetail into something that's feels very perfunctory and uninteresting. I don't think any of them would stand up watched on their own, with the possible exception of maybe 1 or 2 of them. I think for the most part they seem like snippets, segments of things that aren't particularly memorable. The understanding in this particular story is that each of these things that we're seeing is a direct flashback to something that's happened in each of the characters' pasts, something terrible that's happened to them that's to basically spoil the formula of this particular film. Each story will end with the lead character being taken away, and then they end up in this Outpost 37, this experimental facility where they're attempting to weaponize their fears. At one point I was thinking along the lines of, this would kind of make sense if each of these fears was literally just that, and it was a fear that each of the characters was suffering from, well, almost like a series of nightmares that was something deep in the psychological makeup of each of these characters that was then exploited through the tests done at this facility. And in doing that, that would allow each of these stories to deal with more fantastical elements, to make them stand out more and seem more sort of horror based. as opposed to just a collection of random segments of things that rarely stray into anything particularly that interesting. I think the only point in it in which it becomes absolutely clear that this isn't the case is with the last story, where we see the effects of what has actually happened to in one of the segments to one particular character, and then we know that these aren't just fears or phobias, but they actually are just bad things that have happened to each of these characters. So it's tenuous calling this film Phobias, but as with most anthology films, the overarching framework for each of these films doesn't really amount to much at the end of the day. I know that there is an argument that a film such as The ABCs of Death, that just deals with a collection of short films, isn't necessarily an anthology film per se, but literally just a collation of shorts. At least this does put in the effort. It does have that framework. I think the framework's potentially quite interesting, but it doesn't, again, really do anything too unique with it. It does feel like a last-minute kind of bodge job. The segments, as I say, tend to feel kind of undercooked, not quite finished. Some of them have things to recommend them. So first up, we have Robophobia, which is written and directed by Joe Sill and stars Leonardo Nam as Johnny. This is basically a story of a youngish, introverted, tech-obsessed geek. He's Asian, so he's getting picked upon and bullied by fairly stereotypical bullies. He's looking after his elderly father whilst he's got this set up in his room of a load of cameras, a load of computers and stuff, so he can keep an eye on the world, even as he's driven further and further away from it. And ultimately it becomes one of these stories where he finds he's being contacted by somebody known as Friend, who reaches out to him, speaks to him through his camera, and it turns out that this is some strange technological force that Johnny can then harness to turn the tables on his abusers. It's a sort of techno wish fulfillment vigilante fantasy. It's nicely shot, it's nicely directed. I think Leonardo Nam's pretty good. I think of them all, this has probably got the most interesting. It probably looks the best. The idea is pretty underdone. It doesn't amount to anything much other than just a few lines. It's pretty solid though, it's pretty entertaining. Then of course we lead into our first Outpost 37 segment, where we get introduced to Dr. Wright, played by Ross Partridge, in this incredibly over-the-top villainous moustache-twirling performance. I think it's pretty poor for the most part. I like the way it's integrated into each of these segments, but at the same time, I think having Dr. Wright as the guy who connects everything together is kind of flawed. Then we move on to the second segment, which is Vihophobia, written and directed by Marit Lee Go. This stars Hannah Mae Lee as Sammy, and it concerns a pair of young lovers who basically get together and decide to do bad things, and whilst they're doing these bad things, they accidentally run over an old man, and then it becomes kind of a variation on that Creepshow segment that I think it's in Creepshow 2 with Lois Chiles in it, which again I have to say I thought was one of the worst of the Creepshow segments. It's very short, it's done with a very deliberate over-stylization. There's a lot of kind of heavy metal cliches in it, a lot of kind of whirling, self-conscious camera angles and shots. It's got very little dialogue in it, doesn't really amount to much, there's no characters in it, it's just a kind of, it's almost like a music video if I'm honest, which I think is a bit disappointing because I think Hannah Mae Lee is a good actress. She was very funny in both of the Babysitter films. To be fair to her, I think she could do better than this. She's probably one of the more, along with Macy Gray and like Leonardo Nam, she's probably the biggest name in this. I think she's a really interesting actress. I think she's got a very distinct look. I think she's capable of great things. This is definitely not one of them. It makes the first story seem well developed. It's ultra thin. It's about 3 or 4 scenes long, and again it kind of finishes without really making much of a point. I think this is probably one of the poorest of the segments, and it absolutely would not stand up on its own. The third segment is Ephebiphobia, or Ephebiphobia, which apparently means the fear of youth or the fear of teenagers. It's a pretty basic kind of home invasion with a slight twist. Of them all, I think this is the one that probably stands out as the most fully fleshed out. At a push, I could see this stretched out to film length. I think it plays out quite nicely. I think it's quite decently directed. I think it's the only one that really feels like a full story in itself. It's written and directed by Chris von Hoffman, who is, upon looking at it, the most experienced of all the directors in this. I think that shows. I think he does some fairly decent things. Again, it's nothing incredibly new. There are a few moments that are reasonably chilling in it. Again, does it play into a phobia? Not especially, considering the nature of the lead character in it, that suffering from this particular fear, allegedly, isn't exactly in a place to moralise herself. It's interesting, again, that they've chosen a shot from this particular segment to use on the poster. I think that probably speaks to a confidence in this particular story. Just as a side note, though, I have to say I think that this is a really awful poster. I think the name's fairly interesting, but I think this one shot of a sort of bloodied, desperate-looking woman is something we've seen way too much of. It's so uninteresting. There's so many better things you could do with this. I don't think anyone's going to see this cover and be drawn in by it. I think really interesting cover art or poster art for a movie, even something like this that's very low budget, released straight to digital, or could do a lot better than this. And I think dressing up your film nicely does make a difference, no matter how superficial that might seem. But definitely it's fairly traditional territory. There's nothing particularly unique about it. It's a home invasion that deals with a middle school teacher being terrorized by a group of her teenage students. It plays out quite nicely. There's some fun dynamics between... There are 3 teenagers in this. There's an interesting kind of power dynamic between them. It doesn't really amount to too much, but it's just good old-fashioned kind of horror in a fairly tropey way. I think you could say that being old school and traditional is a bad thing if the other segments were experimental, avant-garde, interesting things that sort of displayed the full breadth of what the genre's capable of. In actual fact, they're not. They barely qualify as stories, most of them, whereas this is at least a fairly grounded series of events that play out in quite a nicely directed, fairly tense way. It, of course, has got the infamous "Why are you doing this?" line, which appears in virtually every horror film set in the real world in the last sort of 20 years or so. If it definitely appears in almost every single home invasion film and or torture porn movie. But for me, this probably stands out as overall the best of the segments. Although I have to say, I think that probably in a better anthology, it maybe wouldn't be quite as memorable. So now we come to the 4th segment, which is hoplophobia, or the fear of weapons. This concerns a traumatized SWAT veteran suffering from PTSD. It sees her home life, spending time with her son, trying to live a normal life, but being haunted by things that have happened to her. It culminates in this incredibly ill thought out action scene at the end, which really doesn't do much for the themes of this particular segment. I think of them all, it probably seems the most like probably the most pretentious of them all, because I think it's definitely trying to deal with weightier issues than any of the others, but at the same time it trivializes them by not really knowing what to do with this particular story. Again, it barely qualifies as horror of any sort. It doesn't count as a phobia. It's basically PTSD, not particularly hoplophobia. There isn't much of a display of a fear of weapons in this particular segment. I think the acting's pretty spotty for the most part. I think probably the most interesting thing about this particular segment is that it's directed by actress Camilla Bell, who's been in quite a lot of things, but most notably one of her very first parts, she started off as a child actress in the early 90s. She played Steven Seagal's teenage daughter in The Patriot, the first straight-to-DVD Steven Seagal film, which a lot of people consider to be the film that marked the beginning of the end for Seagal's career. And it's just crazy thinking that small girl in The Patriot has now gone on to direct a fairly unremarkable anthology segment. Again, Forgettable would be more charitable to this than it deserves. It's actually pretty terrible, this particular segment. And then we finally come into the 5th and final segment, which is Atelophobia, which turns out it means the fear of imperfections. And the interesting thing is, there actually is a film already called Atelophobia. It came out in 2015, and it actually spawned a sequel, neither of which I have to say I've seen, but they look kind of interesting. I might check them out after this. So Atelophobia follows Renee, who is an architect. She seems incredibly highly strung. She seems to have a lot of bizarre quirks, bizarre tics to her. She seems very under pressure. She invites a lot of her co-workers or subordinates over to her house for a meal to get on with some work, and then she drugs them, and then bad things happen. So I have to say, this particular segment stars Macy Gray, who was a singer, or who is still a singer. I don't know if she's still pursuing that particular aspect of her career, but out of the entire film, she is without doubt the most valuable player. I think she gives a very good performance. I think she's very unusual in this. We see her throughout in the wraparound segment with these bizarre bandages on her face. She is seen intimidating one of the other characters at one point. She's definitely the one who in this group our eyes are drawn to. She gives a fantastic performance in this, and I actually would like to see this stretched out to full length. I think her character has got a lot of depth. I think it's nicely directed, this particular segment. I think it plays with some fun ideas. It's got this very bizarre, kind of grating, disturbing string soundtrack to it, which I think adds a lot. And the odd thing is that it is written and directed by Jess Varley, who is also credited with directing the Outpost 37 segments, the wraparound for the rest of the film, which is odd because her segment in this is very good. I think it's very nicely done, but I just think that the wraparound is shoddy, tacky, it feels hastily cobbled together. I think this last segment is probably overall the most intriguing. I don't think it particularly does too much with it. It barely even qualifies as a story with a twist, but I think Macy Gray is fantastic in it, and I'd like to see her play a similar kind of bizarre, quirky, potentially psychotic character in more of a long-form horror film. And again, I think of them all, this is definitely the one that most speaks to phobias. In this particular case, somebody who's got an awful lot of psychological issues. She's also, of them all, the character that is the most clearly not a victim, but somebody that is actually in a strict sort of dichotomy. You'd consider her to be a villain. She's somebody whose actions aren't especially excusable in any way, which in a sense makes her more interesting, although for the anthology wraparound story to work, you do need to feel a certain degree of sympathy for the characters, which you do for the most part. But overall, I think this would play out better as a series of shorts without the wraparound. Even though I think the wraparound is an interesting idea, they don't do anything with it, and I think it does kind of drag them down. Although if it did play out as a series of shorts rather than a fully integrated anthology, then the issue is that a lot of them do feel unfinished. Especially the first two, I would say, don't give you much of a payoff, they don't give you much of a twist. I think there are good actors in this. Macy Gray, Hannah May Lee, Leonardo Nam are all really good. In the case of some of them, they're good in this. In the case of most, they are good, but they're not especially good in this. I can't say that I think that many of these directors seem especially talented or especially like people I'd be keen to see more from. I think Joe Sill, who did the Robophobia segment, has got quite an interesting eye for an image. I think Jess Varley has probably got more of a way with performances. I think her segment is well directed, but I think it does come down to Macy Gray's performance. I think a lot of the dialogue in the wraparound, along with this very over-the-top performance from Ross Partridge as this mad scientist, I think a lot of the dialogue is laughably stiff and over-the-top, where they basically explain what's happening with this gruesome device known as the Shrinker. One character asks, why do they call it the Shrinker? And someone else replies, because if you have it used too much on you, it shrinks your brain. And to be honest, after watching Phobias, I feel like my brain has shrunk just a little bit. It's not a good time at all. I think anthologies tend to be more forgivable for the most part, because if you're watching one segment and it's not so great, you go, okay, and what's going to be in the next one? But I think taken in total, this doesn't really have anything much to recommend it. I think it's quite dull. I think if you had to watch just one segment, I would recommend the last one, although the third one, this home invasion story, is kind of fun in a kind of basic nuts and bolts fashion. So I think overall I'm going to have to come in quite harsh on this. Even though there were bits in it that kind of got you going, I think I will have to give this 1 star. It sounds very brutal saying that, but yeah, it's not good. It doesn't use its idea well. It feels unfinished. It feels hastily cobbled together. It wastes a lot of good actors, and even though it's fairly short, it just doesn't bring enough to the table at all. So I would say give Phobias a miss.
The house seems so lonely.
Well, no one's lived here in a very long time, but I think the house is ready for a new occupant, don't you? It might need a little bit of fixing up, some paint chips, a few nails on the wall, but I know the perfect handyman.
Let's move on to Arbors: A Descent now. This is a Canadian film released on the 23rd of March, written and directed by Michael Buffaro and starring Kayla Stanton as Amber and Michael Mitten as Jim. So this is a film about a renowned pianist by the name of Amber Waltz, who is recovering from a traumatic event in her past, who is looking for a new house. She comes into this big, very well-to-do house, decides to buy it, in order to give herself time to work out traumas in her past and to hopefully work on a new symphonic composition. Whilst she's there, she finds herself plagued by bizarre visions. As events continue to escalate, she begins to wonder if everything that's happening is in her head or if she really is being haunted by the spirits of the house's previous owners. This is a film in a long line of psychological thrillers about a woman being on her own in a large house and experiencing psychological traumas, and the people around her trying to convince her that everything she's seeing is just in her head, whilst she herself is struggling with the notion that she might be going insane. It's a fairly old trope. Initially at first, the first times we were ever seeing this sort of thing, I suppose you could go all the way back to something like Rebecca. These films tended to escalate into stories of people being driven mad by somebody in the hopes of claiming their inheritance or sending them off to an asylum so that they could then move in and take over their house or their property or their estate or whatever. Subsequently, later on, we've had films like The Nesting or perhaps The Wind that this kind of is more similar to. I have to say though, I knew this was going to be pretty low budget going into it. There was a point where I was thinking that it was probably one of those films I could do with missing out this month, but in the end what tipped me over was the fact that it was Canadian, because I do of course love Canadian films, and just the idea that the main character in it is a pianist or a musician I found quite interesting, because I'm very enthralled by the idea of musicians, especially sort of classical musicians. I think that lends a nice language, a nice set of images and sounds to a film, and Amber's Descent definitely utilises that. It's got a really nice piano score throughout. So straight away as Amber moves into the house, she's met by a handyman, Jim, played by Michael Mitten, who's greasy, hairy, bearded, he doesn't look particularly savoury, but at the same time he's more of a kind of nerdy outsider figure. I'm not sure that Michael Mitten is necessarily the best choice for this particular part. I don't think he brings anything great. I think there are times when he's called upon to do certain things, to play up certain aspects, and I don't think he does a particularly good job of this. I think he's quite weak, quite insubstantial as an actor. Although whilst I was looking him up, just sort of seeing what his background was, I think it's very interesting looking at his list of credits to date. He's not a hugely experienced actor, but he has played such parts as a teen boy at Pet Shop, a skinny stoner, a scared hippie, band douche, and library student. So I think that kind of gives you the idea of the sort of character we're getting here. I think someone more charismatic might have brought something more to this particular part. The obvious comparison is, as I said, with The Wind, with Wingshauser in The Wind, although whether or not it actually goes in that particular direction is not for me to say at this point in time. I think Kayla Stanton, who plays the lead role of Amber, she's quite basic. I don't think the acting in this from anybody is particularly that memorable. I think it sort of hums along with something of a kind of unremarkable TV movie kind of feel to it. Although that said, it does have surprising elements of nudity to it, which I wasn't expecting, nudity and sexuality, that kind of make it feel even more throwback than it actually is, more of a kind of 70s psychosexual, almost giallo-like in places, although it's obviously playing more in the tradition of female in the house alone psychological thrillers. There's a surprisingly graphic lesbian scene in this, which I wasn't expecting. There is quite a lot of nudity for what it is. I'm not entirely sure it's absolutely necessary, but at the same time I can see why it's there. It doesn't feel especially exploitative, but at the same time it probably is. I think those scenes are some of the more memorable, not necessarily even for the obvious reasons. I actually do think that those scenes have something quite interesting to them. I think Michael Bufaro is somebody who's got quite a few credits to his name and not doing anything particularly that stand out or memorable. I have to say I haven't seen any of his other films before, but he does quite a decent job with this. I think it's pretty solid for the most part. One of the problems I have with these films, now there are an awful lot of films these days made about characters with psychological issues or mental illness or whatever, where the main thread is characters experiencing these bizarre visions. They're getting flashes of things that suggest that we're in horror film territory, and we're being asked to say, is this all in the character's mind or is this really happening to them? Now, the modern version of this that we're seeing so much of tends to refuse to give us obvious answers. They don't commit to saying one way or another whether this is in the character's head or whether it's really happening. I think Amber's Descent is is nice and straightforward enough that it does actually give us a concrete answer. It's got a very nice twist ending. It's not especially original, but it's a good ending, and I think it ties things up quite nicely, and it excuses a lot of vision, dream, haunting scenes that would otherwise seem sort of flabby, the sort of scenes that are included just to stop the horror crowd from falling asleep. I think for all the films that deal with characters undergoing psychological issues, this is one of the more enjoyable ones of late that I've watched, I have to say. I think the title alone, I've had an issue lately with very dull titles that tend to be just the something, really basic titles that don't really tell you too much. Amber's Descent is a title that gives an awful lot away. I don't think it necessarily spoils it, but it definitely tells us immediately what course we're on. Stylistically, it's nothing too special. Some of the sort of fantasy hallucination scenes are done quite nicely. There's some phone conversations that I think are staged in quite a visually interesting way that is at once inventive and perhaps necessitated by this film's low budget. There's a lot of scenes of Amber just sort of wandering around the house. It's not an especially interesting house, I have to say. There are some nice visuals in it, but at the same time there is quite a lot of melancholy staring into the distance scenes. There's a lot of shots of her sort of sitting at the piano or walking around the house barefoot. I think for some odd reason there seem to be an awful lot of shots of Amber's feet, although I do think that there is ultimately a reason for this. I think it suggests her character's state of fragility. When I was reading about this, it described it as, Amber retreating to a house to recover from a trauma in her past. It's depressing, the state of horror films at the moment, that my immediate reaction to that was thinking that it would be a rape. That this would be a film where Amber had been raped and she was having to deal with that kind of trauma and those kind of issues, which I think we're seeing an awful lot of in horror films. I have to say, I think too much. I do understand it's a very important issue. It's not something that I really want to see in horror films just because I think it's depressing and it ultimately doesn't get anywhere. The trauma in this is of a more straightforward variety, which perhaps once again strengthens the idea that this is something of a throwback film. I don't think that it is in any way a pretentious film. I don't think it feels like it's trying to make a bigger point than it ultimately is. I think perhaps the only concession to pretension is that it opens with a huge Beethoven quote, old Ludwig van. We see a bust of Beethoven in prominent place on Amber's mantelpiece. It's fairly relevant to the action. I don't think it's especially egregious. I do think the size of it is perhaps a little much for this kind of film. It is a nice quote though, that said. In the end, though, I think the fact that it doesn't descend into misery is nice. The psychological issues in the film are fairly straightforward, simplified to fit the needs of this particular narrative. It's a nice, middle-of-the-road psychological thriller with horror flourishes, and it's got a very solid and quite satisfying twist at the end of the day, which means that I would probably say that Amber's Descent gets 3 stars out of 5. I think the acting could be better. I think perhaps some of the hallucination or the visions or the haunting scenes could be a little bit better, but ultimately it does all come together nicely. For me, this is just the right kind of no frills, unpretentious horror entertainment that I find totally enjoyable. Just turn it on, switch off and enjoy it. It's just an entertaining little film. Another Canadian film that I enjoyed this month. So yeah, Amber's Descent, give it a shot by all means.
Right. Hey, there was something that I wanted you to come see.
Well, where is he?
It's back at my place.
Well, what is it?
I don't even know. You just gotta see it.
Okay, well, I can't right now.
Well, it's not gonna take long. I could give you a lift over.
So next up we've got a film that goes by the name of The Arbors. This is an American film released on the 26th of March. It is written and directed by Clayton Whitmer, who is making his feature debut. It concerns 2 brothers, Ethan and Shane, played by Drew Matthews and Ryan Davenport respectively, living out in a small, quiet, sleepy little town. Ethan, who is our main character, he is a locksmith, very socially awkward, seems to have trouble fitting in. His brother Shane seems more successful, he's got a family, he's got a wife, he seems to be successful, he seems to be more liked. One night Ethan finds a strange creature in the middle of the road, he takes it home, and then from there events take a surprising turn. But really what we see here is a small town character drama played out between these two brothers and some of the characters around them. Now, The Arbors is a film that I needed a lot of persuasion to actually watch, because all the signs were that it wasn't going to be something that I particularly enjoyed, but never let it be said that I don't have an open mind. First problem is that it's basically 2 hours long. I think that once again that shows a certain lack of discipline. It's not necessarily the case universally, but in the case of The Arbors, I think 2 hours is very long for what we get. I've seen films that were shorter than this that I felt were too long. I don't think the length is necessarily the issue in The Arbors. I think it's more of a problem that The Arbors is one of those films that plays its horror elements very, very lightly indeed. Now, I'm totally of the belief that the horror genre can accommodate a great deal of different styles, different forms. One of the things that bugs me is films that are Trojan horses, where we basically get, in this case, a small-town familial drama film that just happens to have enough metaphorical horror elements to it to allow it a place in the genre. I have to say, I think that the basic conceit of this film is that our lead character, Ethan, who's incredibly socially awkward, he has a kind of a yearning to turn back time, to make things the way they used to be when he was younger, when he was the older brother, and his younger brother Shane sort of looked up to him, even though he was ill-fitted to that particular position. It turns out that Ethan isn't particularly good at anything. He's one of those small-town failures that just kind of fizzles out and never amounts to anything. We get the notion that he was probably a lot more likeable, he was a lot more socially capable when he was younger, when he was at school. He talks about his past a lot, whereas his brother Shane doesn't harken back to the good old days in any meaningful sense. It's a really depressing kind of portrait of just a person failing in life. I did find the drama scenes quite emotional, quite effective in this. Even though I have to say that I don't especially think Drew Matthews, who plays Ethan, is that good an actor. I think he's called upon to basically look as sullen and slab-like as possible. The dialogue is very stilted, very awkward. It does feel fairly naturalistic for the most part. The family scenes are effective in evoking what they're trying to evoke. The problem is when it veers into horror territory. So the central conceit is there's this creature that Drew has found. He keeps it in a box. He really wants to show it to his brother. His brother doesn't really care whatsoever. And as a result, the creature grows larger and larger, and it starts preying on and killing the people around him. It's done in a very unusual way, a very kind of off-kilter way. It clearly suggests that the events that we're seeing aren't necessarily meant to be literal. There's something a lot more metaphorical going on here. I've seen a lot of people describe this as a creature feature, and more than that, I've seen people saying that it's not a creature feature. It's absolutely not a creature feature. It's not a film about a giant killer insect on the rampage killing small-town villagers. It's a film about a socially awkward locksmith just being a failure at life, staring off into the distance, not reacting to anything, not saying anything to anybody. I understand the purpose, but I think if you cut out all the scenes with the creature in them, which honestly, in a 2-hour film probably amounts to about 2 minutes of screen time, then I think this would be pretty good for what it is. My only issue is, at the end of the day, this is a horror film of sorts. It has definite horror aspects to it, it has scenes that are horrific, and it does include these scenes of a creature killing people very occasionally. So I think what you end up with is a film that plays out straightforwardly as a drama with sort of slightly horrific aspects to it. My biggest problem with it is that it's very, very long, which suggests that the makers of it are very much in love with these characters, they're very much in love with their evolution. It's very, very slow-paced, you don't really get too much happening, and I think a lot of the character dilemmas that we see, the sort of character interactions that we see played out, are very, very opaque and sort of difficult to interpret. I think our lead character Ethan is particularly difficult to get any kind of handle on. I think the performance has been crafted to a position where we're basically getting a character that's giving nothing away, somebody who's lost every vestige of their humanity. It throws up some interesting ideas as it goes along, but it ultimately doesn't really do enough with it to hold our attention. It's certainly very, very, very light on using the things that make it unique. I think the marketing for it is not especially great, although I have to say I think that's a very weak argument. I don't think a film can be made or broken based on its marketing, because that's ultimately not really got anything to do with the film itself. That's to do with how you perceive it and what you expect going into it. What I expected going into it was a very slow-paced film with almost no genre aspects whatsoever. I was expecting something perhaps a little more straightforward, not necessarily something quite as oblique and convoluted as this. I think I surprised myself because I find one of the things that I hate most about films that foreground family dramas over more supernatural or anything more horror-based is that they tend to involve endless scenes of arguing, as though that is a substitute for character interactions. I have to say I was pleasantly surprised that the acting in this, for the most part, felt quite naturalistic. I did find myself quite affected by some of the ideas that it throws up, just because they're very sad and very kind of gloomy and miserable. It's not a film you can really enjoy whatsoever. I certainly would not be in a hurry to watch it again. I do think one of the things that's more memorable in it is it's got a very nice piano sort of soundtrack going along in the background that sounds almost like it's a kind of an evolution of the Moonlight Sonata, you know, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. There are quite a lot of scenes, perhaps as appropriate to something that feels more of a family drama. There's a lot of scenes of quite on-the-nose self-definition. I think there's characters sort of saying things like, I can't run away from my problems, you know, if you stay too long you become a part of a place. I think there's interesting ideas played with here that aren't necessarily the same old tired mental health cliches that we tend to see. I think this place is something more troubling. I think if you can relate to this character, which I think whether it applies to you or someone you know or it's a particular fear of yours, I think you will find something to relate to in this particular character. But at the same time, I find him so unlikable and impenetrable that I think it loses points. I think the times when Drew Matthews is actually called upon to emote, and there's basically one scene I'm thinking of, it's played out very much as a kind of acting school monologue, complete with these big pauses. It really reveals his weaknesses as an actor. I definitely enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to. I think enjoy is the wrong word because I really didn't take too much enjoyment out of it. It is very somber, and I think ultimately the horrors of it aren't the horrors of a giant parasitic killing machine, but are in actual fact the horrors of something very real, very domestic, and very relatable. It is a very sad film. I think it moves into self-indulgent territory very quickly. I think the dialogue becomes more flowery and more impressed with itself as it goes on. I think the ending is quite emotionally overwrought. I think it could be a lot better. It's got an ending that isn't especially satisfactory, I have to say, although I wasn't really expecting anything more. I don't think it's ridiculously boring. I think it's dull because it does feel too long, but at the same time, I think the story that this film's telling requires more of a sort of a languorous pace and requires us to really feel these long drawn-out painful silences. If that sounds like something that you're interested in, if your interests run to horror films that basically aren't horror films but are more about closeted metaphorical cautionary tales, then I think The Arbors might have something for you. At the end of the day, I can't really go any higher than 2 stars for it. I think the soundtrack's nice. I think the actings could be better. I think the script is okay until it becomes too impressed with itself. I think Clayton Whitmer, writer-director, I think probably thinks it to be better than it probably is. It does feel quite self-important in places, like it thinks it's doing something weightier than it actually is, but it's not too bad. It's not as bad as I expected it to be for this sort of film. I think it will appeal to a very limited subset of the audience, perhaps an audience that doesn't really cleave to very, very stylized horror films. So give The Arbors a shot if you want. I personally didn't enjoy it too much, but then it's not a film that you're really meant to enjoy.
Violence, it only begets violence. And violence is a sin.
So, our brothers who died for our country in the Great War, our sinners also, are they?
The church is closed.
Everyone is welcome in the house of God, surely.
War is a sin.
And what is your vice, I wonder?
So let's turn our attention now to a film called The Banishing. This was released on the 26th of March. It's a British film directed by Christopher Smith, who you might know from directing Severance, Triangle, Black Death. He's definitely got some genre chops. It stars John Heffernan, Sean Harris and Jessica Brown Findlay. It's a pretty straightforward haunted house film in a great British tradition. It sees a young clergyman and his wife coming together to live in this large, quite dilapidated looking stately home that inevitably hides a great deal of secrets. There are a lot of skeletons in the closets of these particular characters, and as they settle in and try to recreate a kind of domestic bliss for themselves, they start to be assaulted by these unusual apparitions, strange visions, whilst at the same time they're battling issues of a more earthy nature, more realistic problems in the relationship, troubles from their past resurfacing, and everything comes together as they try to uncover the secrets of this particular house, whilst also hopefully dealing with their own issues. Now that sounds fairly straightforward. It's a period piece, it's set in the 1930s, so straight away, one of the things that we've seen quite a lot of this month or this year is a thing that tends to be quite prevalent in horror films these days, is that we've seen a lot of directorial debuts. There are people that use the horror genre as a chance to get a foot on the ladder. It's an accepted piece of industry wisdom that the easiest way to get a film made is to make a low-budget horror film and then to work your way up. We've seen this happen with a lot of people. One of the reasons for this is that the horror genre tends to have very forgiving fans, and that also that the horror genre is seen as something that's fairly straightforward to do. It doesn't necessarily involve huge budgets. You don't necessarily even need to have a huge name cast. You know, you don't need big expensive cast members. Compared to something like a science fiction film or an action movie, a horror film can be made well, it can be made cheaply, a lot easier than a lot of other films. Now in some cases the directors are genuinely passionate about the small low budget horror movies that they start their careers off with, and other times they just tend to churn it out as, okay, this is something I need to get out of the way before I can get on to making films of a size and a nature that I actually want to make. Directorial debuts are interesting. I always think it's good to see something from a new creative voice. We never know who's going to turn out to be one of the big names in the genre going forwards, but I think the good thing is with The Banishing is that we're seeing a film that's directed by somebody who knows the ropes, he knows what he's doing, and he's stuck with the genre after all this time. As exciting as it is to see fresh material from new directors, it's also incredibly nice to see something that's made by somebody that actually knows what they're doing. And The Banishing displays a strong visual sense. It's got a really nice, rich, deep, lush kind of period feel to it. The cinematography is lovely, the sets are great, the camera works smooth, it's fluid, it's interesting, and it's all got a polished, assured quality to it. Even though this isn't an incredibly expensive film, it looks very good for what it is. And the cast are interesting. They have just enough chops amongst them to be able to elevate the material. I think the lead character in this, Marianne, played by Jessica Brown Findlay, who you might know from Downton Abbey and a host of other British things, I think she's very good. I think she's very charismatic. She makes the part really interesting. She's able to bring out depth to the character without resorting to incredibly over-the-top, ridiculous histrionics. I think John Heffernan as her husband, Linus, I think he also is able to suggest a great deal to his character. At the same time, I have to say I don't think that Linus's character is particularly well served by the narrative. His character kind of falls out of the way to ultimately accommodate different storylines. His character is kind of relegated towards the end in a way that doesn't feel particularly satisfying, given how much build-up his character has throughout the opening acts of the film. I think ultimately this is the kind of film that will appeal to you, or it won't necessarily appeal to you. I have to say that I particularly like British films. I think this has got a nice feel to it. It really doesn't play with anything that we haven't seen before, but it does so in a nice, assured way that reveals a director that actually knows what he's doing and has got quite a feel for this kind of material. It sort of coasts along quite nicely with a range of fairly interesting kind of haunted house kind of tropes to it. It never descends into the kind of overwrought soap opera personal dilemmas that you'd get with an American film like The Conjuring or the Amityville Horror. It's more buttoned down as is appropriate to the period, but at the same time it does kind of go into a territory where manifestations of spirits in this particular house tie into issues that the characters are having in their own relationships, which I think can seem a little bit heavy-handed at times. I think the idea that a haunted house is ultimately ultimately seconded into telling a story about a relationship can feel a little bit heavy-handed at times. I don't think it's particularly subtle. I think the period dialogue in this is very nice. I think it's delivered convincingly. There's one character in this who is Harry Price, played by Sean Heiress, who I have to say I think tends to overact rather. He's the character that kind of stands out as being not of the period. He's very flamboyant. It's a very over-the-top kind of performance. His character does ultimately become quite important to the story, which I think isn't necessarily that good of a thing, but I don't think he's necessarily bad enough to take away from anything. I just think his performance is too overburdened with tics and weird flourishes and things compared to everyone else who feels very much of a piece, feels very, I think John Lynch as a character named Malachi, who, as you've probably guessed, isn't necessarily up to any good. I think he's exceptional. I think the cast's really good. I think the look of it's good. I think it nails the period really well. There are scenes of characters watching newsreel footage of the rise of the Nazi Party, these sort of Hitler rallies that are meant to provoke kind of fear and paranoia amongst the people that are watching them. Now, I think the parallels that it's drawing with the outbreak of the Second World War do occasionally seem a little bit film schooly, but it doesn't really hit you over the head with it. It's not hammered home particularly, but I think that it's one of those things where because they've set it in this period, they feel the need to bring in this huge historical landmark, whereas the reality is I think that a lot of people probably in the period that this film was set wouldn't necessarily be involved with the events of history in this fashion. By the end of it, when we kind of see where it's all going, that it feels just nice enough that you think, okay, that's fair enough. I don't think that was too much. But at the same time, the film really wouldn't lose anything if you took out these particular sequences. It does kind of dovetail into quite a nice fable about unity and the strength of overwhelmingly divisive horrors. Although again, I think drawing connections between something of that nature and a fairly basic haunted house ghost story does feel a little bit overwrought at times. Speaking of overwrought, there are some flashback scenes in this that I think tip perilously close to the territory of something like Neil Marshall's The Reckoning or Darren Bousman's Saint Agatha, where we get these really rich, fruity, tortury Inquisition scenes. They're nothing too explicit, but everything in them's really punched up to 11. I think they're meant to be the moments of real kind of operatic horror in it. I think that the dialogue in those sequences is very unsubtle, and I think that they could have been handled perhaps in a better way. One of the things that I found when I was watching this was it reminded me of the 1974 film Ghost Story, directed by Stephen Weeks, which is another kind of haunted house film that's very much based on the works of M.R. James. The interesting thing about Ghost Story is some of the flashbacks in this actually parallel things from Ghost Story. I would be surprised if Christopher Smith wasn't aware of Ghost Story. I have to say, though, I don't think Ghost Story is a film that's known enough in the horror genre. I think that's a really, really great film. I think The Banishing is a lot more straightforward. It's a lot more nuts and bolts than Ghost Story, which was a really nice love letter to Victorian ghost stories, whereas this is far more in the tradition of something like the Amityville Horror, but done with a distinctively period British language and style to it. But for me, I think that The Banishing is a really nice throwback little film. It just chugs along nicely on goodwill and love and respect for the genre. It's got some nice images. It plays around with mirrors in a way that I think is clever without being particularly heavy-handed. I think it's definitely not a film that's got anything incredibly unique to it, but at the same time, I really enjoyed The Banishing. I actually surprised myself. I'm going to give it 3 stars out of 5, just because it's really nicely done. I think everyone involved in it seems like they believe in what they're doing. I'd lose it points because I think Sean Heiress is very over the top in it. I think he's the only cast member that I don't think gives a performance that fits in with what he's doing. He seems like he's just doing his own thing and ignoring everybody else. But yeah, if you want a really nice film that just manages to capture the period very well without necessarily relying to huge over-the-top shrieking, banging manifestations of the supernatural that just ticks along quite nicely, then I would definitely say that this is a film that's worth checking out. It's nothing huge, but it is very entertaining. I enjoyed it greatly.
The Vatican adopted, well, shall we say, negative attitude toward the practice of exorcism. There were a number of controversial cases that unfortunately were made public. The situation was not merely embarrassing, it was untenable. Something had to be done. So the church simply walked away from it, simply stopped teaching the rites of exorcism.
I think Now it's time to come on to The Seventh Day. This is a film released on the 26th of March. It stars Guy Pearce, Stephen Lang and Keith David. It is directed by Justin P. Lange, who also directed The Dark in 2018. This is his second film. It's a fairly straightforward exorcist tale, pairing a young rookie exorcist, Father Daniel, with an older, experienced veteran, Father Peter, played by Guy Pearce, and them going about their daily lives as exorcists, battling for the souls of the people that they come across, whilst also struggling with their own personal demons. As you can guess, it's not especially unique. It's stuff we've all seen before. So The Seventh Day opens up with this flashback to 1985, in which we see that the origins of these characters, we see one of them younger, and we see Keith David as well, who is playing Father Louis. He is an actor with great genre chops. He's been a favourite of John Carpenter's, been in some great movies, and disappointingly, he's killed off within the first 10 minutes of the film. That's not a spoiler. He's basically a cameo in this. He's a cameo with a saleable name attached to it. And once Keith David dies, the entire film plummets. We've got this kind of child choir music over the top of everything, which sort of opens with this stock footage of the Pope and priests and things. It's very overwrought, it's very silly, it sort of plays everything incredibly seriously without any kind of self-awareness of what it's doing, or even much particular feel for genre material as a whole. I think it's pretty cliched, pretty tedious. The dialogue is flat and awful. Characters just expounding, explaining their own problems, which I just find the worst. People that have never met just suddenly, but after about an hour, just sitting down and opening up their hearts. Characters are all very kind of taciturn and monosyllabic. There's no real atmosphere. I don't really care for any of these people. The soundtrack ticks every box in the list of demonic cliches. It's just chanting, low notes and things. It's bad. It really is a bad film. It's got no pace whatsoever. The acting is of the lowest level, which is sad. Stephen Lang is somebody that I think is pretty decent. He's virtually unrecognisable. He isn't used at all. Vadhir Derbez, who plays Father Daniel, who is our sort of lead character, delivers just an appalling performance. He's really dull, really uninteresting. He's our sort of entrance point into this world of underground exorcisms. We get this sort of speech at the start that exorcisms are sort of being driven underground, that is something that the church no longer actively engages in. And Guy Pearce plays Father Peter, who's this swaggering, overconfident, cynical, just a collection of bad stereotypes. I have to say, I've never really been particularly impressed with Guy Pearce as an actor. I think probably the best film that I can think of he was in was Lawless. I think he gave a pretty solid, if two-dimensional performance in that. But the interesting thing is that Guy Pearce is at least nominally the name actor in this film. And I can't see for the life of me why he was chosen for this part, because he brings absolutely nothing apart from an incredibly large amount of eyeliner. He just sort of sits and sulks and expounds in these really crappy little monologues. I think the demonic scenes are handled with absolutely no flair whatsoever. I don't understand the point of making something that's this tediously generic. It's really got nothing going for it whatsoever. I really don't have too much more to say than that, other than it's kind of cemented my belief that Guy Pearce isn't a great actor. I think he's capable of better things than this, but he brings no upper level chops to it. I think for somebody that has acted in huge films, he gives a worse performance than people in this that have barely acted at all. There's a twist at the end that feels just pointless. The characters arrive at this moment of revelation in such a perfunctory way. It's insulting. Even though the exorcism genre as a whole, I think, felt played out years ago, I was kind of interested in this film. I was hoping for something more. I don't know exactly what I was hoping for, but it absolutely didn't deliver. I'd say this is one of the worst films of the year, but it might even be the worst film I've seen this year up until this point. I'm going to have to give it a hard 1 star. Don't watch The Seventh Day. There's a million better exorcist films. There's a million better horror films out there that you could be watching. This is just flat, tedious, dull. I haven't seen The Dark, and I have to say, after having watched this, I have absolutely no interest in seeing it. I just want to forget The Seventh Day, which shouldn't be too hard, because already, it's not been long ago since I've seen it, but I've already banished most of it from my mind. I'm already struggling to remember what took up 87 minutes of my life.
You know, I really like that picture. The picture on your profile, I really like it. Are you like a photographer or something?
Yeah, not an especially good one, but yes.
Maybe you're being a little too hard on yourself.
Oh, maybe you just have low standards.
Maybe.
I think now it's probably time to talk about The Toll. This is a Canadian film released on the 26th of March. It's got a Saban Films production credit on it. It's written and directed by Michael Nader, making his feature film debut. He has directed a lot of short films already, and it stars Jordan Hayes as Cammy and Max Toplin as Spencer. So what we get here is a woman who takes an Uber-like taxi service to go out to her father's cabin out in the woods, out in the middle of nowhere in the woods. The driver she ends up with is Spencer, who at first seems incredibly socially awkward. As they spend time together on the journey, he starts to manifest some strange behaviour. Alarm bells are going off. He starts to look like he might be quite a bit of a weirdo, perhaps even more than that. As the relationship is kind of grinding along, where it looks like it's heading towards a predictable serial killer format, suddenly they stop in the middle of the woods. They take a detour down a strange side road, and then they ultimately end up confronted with a lot of signs, a lot of warning signs, a lot of detours, and then bizarre handwritten warnings start to appear around them, and suddenly they realise that things have taken a dark turn. They have been confronted with the Toll Man. Now, the Toll is a lot of things. It starts off with these very, very naturalistic sequences played out between Cammy and Spencer in the car along the journey. It's all at night. There's a lot of really interesting atmosphere. The performances are fantastic, and we are wondering where this is going to go. And we pivot back and forth between Spencer is obviously up to no good, and then we are then in turn made to feel bad for suspecting the worst of Spencer. Is he just a socially inept loner? Or is he something more sinister? And that's a question that the film asks. But also at the same time, by the half-hour mark, by the end of the first act, when they break down in the woods, they have a kind of a cathartic confrontation in which things are brought to the surface, and we realise that what Cammy is feeling is in actual fact just her mind naturally going to the worst possible scenario. And it plays a lot with who is the predator and who is the prey, okay? And the good thing is, if it was a film where there was a killer Uber driver picking up passengers and killing them, it would not lampshade this trope in the way that this film does. It has its characters bringing up natural fears about this kind of situation, about two people being thrown together who don't know anything about each other in a confined space, going off to the middle of nowhere, and both characters get a chance to voice their own particular fears, and I think that's really, really interesting. I think that's a great dynamic. I think it's very well handled. I think the dialogue is absolutely naturalistic, and I think it works incredibly well. So what I do when I watch films, I don't necessarily do this all the time, but sometimes I feel myself doing it. I find myself mentally thinking, okay, this is about a 4, or this is definitely a 9 so far. At times during a film, I'll go, okay, this is getting better, this is great. And, I'll start going up a point, or I'll go, that twist sucks, it's not a 6, it's a 5.5 now. And I sort of mentally adjust my scores for a film in my head whilst I'm watching it. I don't even necessarily know that I'm doing it. Sometimes it just happens instinctively. Half an hour into The Toll, I would probably have given it about an 8 or an 8.5. I think the opening's great. I think the first act is fantastic. Once more, I was finding myself thinking, this is another fantastic Canadian film, because I adore Canadian films. But the problem is, when it steps away from the naturalistic, it then veers off into the central idea, which is the Toll Man. The Toll Man is basically a character that is expecting a toll to be paid for trespassing into his territory. Now, it's not a physical territory, it's a psychological territory, which perhaps suggests where this film is going. The idea of the Toll Man is that if you enter his domain with murder in your mind, he will not let you leave until he has claimed a victim. Okay? Which, on the surface, does sound a bit mental, but in the context of the film, it sounds good, because both these characters are in their heads, have gone to the worst possible scenario, and are planning out what to do next. Okay? So that's our setup, that's what we get. Both these characters are thinking that they're in a dangerous situation and they're getting prepared to do what they have to do. So what we're being made to think is their subconscious desire to fight back is being interpreted as a willingness to kill. And then the tall man forces these two characters into a series of psychological tests to basically kind of dig deep down inside themselves and to ultimately provoke one of them into giving him his toll, which is a life. Now, I think the tall man is a fantastic idea. It's one of these kind of pseudo-urban legends that's delivered convincingly, it's well thought out, and it's played out in quite a naturalistic and interesting way. The Toll is a film that puts the tall man bang on the poster, okay? So we're not in any doubt of who the tall man actually is, although we don't necessarily get to see him a lot. He is more of a force of nature than an actual physical being. But he is able to bend reality. So these characters are stranded out in the woods with their own particular set of fears, and the tall man bends reality to his whim so that he can get what he wants. Now that's an incredibly powerful and incredibly threatening idea. My problem is that once they get out of the car, once they've had this catharsis, and once the film settles into this path where its characters undergoing psychological manipulation, the Toll loses everything about it that makes it unique. One of my problems in talking about a film like The Toll is it's okay. It gets quite predictable and quite dull when it's delving into its characters' psychologies, because I think the characters are less interesting as fleshed out characters with backstories and dilemmas than they are as ciphers for a situation that we can probably all relate to, which is why I think the first act works so well. I think once again this film falls into the trap of making itself all about the politics of the personal rather than the immediacy of a situation that we understand and can play out in our heads logically as something that would definitely be scary. Because initially, The Toll plays out every single logical fear of this situation. It's almost like a fantastic short film, the first half hour of this, without a resolution, it has to be said. When our characters get weight and get depth and get backstories, it just becomes soap opera, and I lose all interest I have, because the tall man isn't ultimately a fearsome presence. He's just an excuse to force the characters into working out their own personal problems. That would be forgivable. There's a few sequences in it that resort to really over-the-top, bad, shrieking, loud, chaotic music that's meant to make things scary. It doesn't. It flattens the scene. It destroys the scenes. The absolute biggest problem I have with this is the ending. The ending sucks beyond belief, because it takes everything that's good about The Toll and then just sets fire to it. It's such a pointless, annoying ending. I'd love to go into it, but the problem with the ending is not only is it disappointing, but it invalidates the whole point of the film. It ruins everything that makes it unique and that could make it progressive. And when I say progressive, I don't mean progressive in the way that most critics would use the word progressive. I mean progressive in the sense that it's finally getting away from the same shit we've seen in every single form of media for the last 5 years. I'm so fed up of these particular tropes. It ultimately gets you going. It makes you think this is really interesting. It's doing something that I haven't seen before, which is really putting a lot of these scary predator tropes under the microscope and then exposing them before ultimately moving into more interesting territory, and it just destroys them and says, yeah, this is just another one of these films. So I'm so unbelievably disappointed in The Toll. The problem is trying to work out where I'd come in it at a rating, because the start of it is brilliant and the ending of it is utter shite. And when you realise that the destination of this particular film is a dumpster fire, then it instantly makes you less forgiving of things in it that you might overlook in other circumstances. Like the fact that all the signs that are presented to the characters that are meant to be intimidating are all written in this ridiculously over-the-top Microsoft creepy font. Handwritten in a creepy font. I think that the first time we see the tall man, I think there's only really one good shot we get of the tall man. I think he doesn't look particularly great. I don't think he's handled with any great eye for an image, and I just think that at the end of the day this just goes from bad, creeping around in the woods, random things happening, cliches, to ultimately this just disgustingly disappointing finale. Although I have to say, perhaps a strange side effect of this is that I would actually quite like to see a Toll 2, because I think the Tall Man is quite a good idea. I think you could do something more with it as long as it wasn't this obviously didactic. So a huge disappointment with The Toll, a Canadian film. I think this is the only Canadian film of the month that really let me down. So overall, I think that the only fair rating for this, given that the start of it is amazing, the middle of it is average, and the end of it is utter shite, that I'm going to have to give it 2.5 stars. It could have been so much more. In a way, it's realistically a lower rating than this, because I couldn't really bring myself to watch this again. I have seen people giving it incredibly high reviews. I don't know necessarily how honest or reliable those good reviews are. I don't know if they're just Access Media puff pieces, but The Toll is a very disappointing film. It's got a lot of potential. I wouldn't necessarily discount director Michael Nader entirely based on this, although even though I think that the suspense scenes are very well handled and very nicely directed, I think when it comes to delivering more sort of outre horror material, that it does seem quite lazy and quite uninterested in what it's doing. So The Toll, for me, is a huge miss.
I tell you that the lame widow from Rotten Earth will get her revenge. She will get what she wants.
Get what?
They threw her into that pit, naked, eternally freezing. The widow won't allow anyone to leave this forest alive.
So next up we have a film called The Widow, or Vdova. This is a Russian film released on the 30th of March. It concerns a group of volunteers that go into the woods in search of a missing teenager. Once there, they find a naked old woman who seems to be in a state of extreme distress. Whilst questioning her, they come across a mysterious local legend known as the Lame Widow. As the hunt for the missing child continues, strange things start to happen as night draws in. Now, the interesting thing about The Widow is that it opens up as a found footage film, and everything I'd seen about it described it as a found footage film, but in actual fact it isn't at all. There are occasional moments that use a found footage language, and the opening kind of framework sequence for it, where we get locals interviewed and we get the usual intertitles saying this is based on a true story, this is the story of a group of people that vanished mysteriously, are all straight found footage tropes. After the opening 10 minutes we get the credits coming in, and then after that the film then moves into just straight, fully orchestrated, carefully shot and directed normal film sequences. So it's unusual why they felt the need to have this found footage framework, and why so many people are describing this as a found footage film when it clearly isn't. One of the problems with this is that it does occasionally lapse into moments of found footage. There's a sort of a local television reporter that goes along with the group, and occasionally we see segments that are ostensibly newsreel segments that she's shooting of this hunt for this missing teenage boy. And the bizarre thing is, as the movie goes on and begins to get darker and more mysterious and strange things start happening, it will occasionally lapse into a found footage style. And the problem with this is, it's a movie that basically cherry picks all the worst aspects of the found footage, which is the excessive shaky cam, where you basically can't see anything that's going on whatsoever. It's what people who don't like found footage films think of found footage films as being like. It takes all the worst aspects, but it has none of the good things. Found footage, when it's done right, I'm thinking the Blair Witch Project, is a pretty decent genre. It's a hard one to get into because you can always be guaranteed that the visuals are never going to be particularly polished, but what it does bring to the table is a feeling of immediacy and realism if it's done well. If the performances are all delivered on a realistic level, then a good found footage film can be really quite striking and can really get straight to the jugular. The segments in this that tend to be of a found footage nature have the worst kind of shrieking over the top soundtrack laid over the top of them, which means that we're getting found footage visuals with lazy, bad music laid over the top of them, which manages to please neither found footage enthusiasts or found footage haters, and you just end up with something that you can't see and you don't want to hear. So this is a Russian film. I have to say that I watched a dubbed version of this, which probably didn't do it any favours. I think dubbing usually tends to flatten out a film, particularly a film like this, though I don't think that a good subtitled version of this would necessarily elevate it to any great heights. I think it's still pretty basic. I don't think the dubbing really managed to bring it down to any great degree, because what this basically is is it's a group of people trekking through the forest at night, wandering around in circles, and occasionally something will happen. Occasionally this old lady will say something sinister, a sort of witchy pronouncement, you know, you're all going to die, no one's going to come out of here alive. And then occasionally something will happen, they'll bump into something, there'll be a loud noise. There's not much happens in this, I have to say. A lot of it is just kind of creeping about, because it's kind of going for that realistic nature. It's not the absolute realism of a found footage, but it's playing the events as though they are pretty realistic for the most part. It doesn't tend to exaggerate events to any great histrionic levels of scariness. As a result, none of the characters really undergo any great development or any arcs. Everyone's pretty self-contained, buttoned down, which is fair enough. You know, I don't expect huge emotional storylines in a film like this, which is basically a folk horror tale set in the woods. It's more about the visuals and the atmosphere, and I have to say I don't consider either to be particularly that worthy of note in this. Although that said, this is a film that's based on this made-up sort of local superstition, which in this case is the Lame Widow. The Lame Widow is a character we see represented in cave drawing etchings of this unusual figure with sort of broken legs, and we also see there are big representations of it in these bizarre, huge kind of like statues made out of straw, not unlike the Blair Witch Project, where you get these huge straw figures made in the shape of the Lame Widow. Now, I think the folklore that they've conceived for the Lame Widow is pretty interesting. I think it's a good idea. I think it sounds good. It looks pretty decent, but again, the problem is we don't really get to see it at all. The poster image for the Widow is particularly striking. It definitely got me excited. This was going to be a kind of a film that built to this great revelation of a truly terrifying kind of monster witch type figure. It doesn't really do that at all. Instead, all the horror sequences are just shaky cam to within an inch of their life, so you basically don't see any more than occasional flashes of something, which would be okay if it was done in a naturalistic way, but I think none of the visuals are sufficiently scary that they can survive having this huge over-the-top shrieking, this is terrifying music laid over the top of everything. I think really bad, loud, shrieky music can really, really kill atmosphere of any kind. I think either no score or something very subtle, like in the Blair Witch remake. It's got this very unsettling, dark sound design throughout it that manages to create a good atmosphere. I think the music in this really does let it down, but at the same time the visuals don't really amount to much anyway, so no great loss. Characters are pretty minimal, you don't get any particular standouts. They're all fairly uninteresting, I have to say. It's one of those films where you're kind of asking yourself, is anything going to happen? And then when it does happen, it's not really especially that satisfying. There's a few moments that are quite interesting that I think do slightly work. There's a moment that looks set up to deliberately mirror the most famous shot, well, maybe not the most famous, but the final shot of the Blair Witch Project, with a character with their back turned to somebody, that develops into quite a nice image that's played out quite subtly and interestingly. There's not really much of a reason for it other than it's just something weird that happens. It's one of those films where things just kind of happen and you accept it because the characters are in a haunted space, so that justifies weird shit happening. Bizarrely, there's this, they're looking for this young child who's apparently a teenager, but they come across a talking teddy bear that for some reason in the dubbing of this they've decided to give a Chucky-like voice, and he actually says, you know, Chucky-type lines like, do you want to be my friend, and want to play. I think he actually says wanna play at one point, this toy teddy bear, this toy talking teddy bear that they come across. It's meant to be one of these ironic, the teddy bear with one eye missing, to suggest something sinister has happened to this child. This ironically friendly teddy bear that's in a state of disrepair, that's all that's left behind of this child, is meant to sort of chill us, but it's an odd choice. Probably more of an issue with the dubbing rather than with the original. If you cut out all the found footage elements from this, I still don't think it would be up to much. I probably would have rather it actually gone full found footage, to be honest, because I think we don't tend to see much found footage, and I was expecting this to be a found footage film based on what I'd heard about it. When it sort of morphed into just a film with a soundtrack and carefully chosen cinematography, I thought, okay, that's fair enough. I think even if this didn't have any of those odd found footage trappings, it would still be disappointing. Atmosphere not great. I did feel a bit cheated by the end of it, especially with that incredibly striking poster. I was very disappointed at the lack of any manifestation of this character character, because it's not especially subtle. It's not one of those films where you feel that expecting to see a manifestation of this huge, weird creature would cheapen it in any way, because it's pretty unsubtle throughout. I think the found footage framework is baffling. I think some of the music, when it's just kind of going along and it's creating a sense of drive, is okay, but again, there's too much bad music in it for me to say that I like the music in any significant way. I actually find that I do quite like films from slightly further afield, other than, you know, your American, British, Canadian, whatever. I think Russian films, for the most part, are quite interesting just because they've got a different way of thinking to us. Although I don't think, apart from the fact that it's quite folklore driven, I don't think this feels in any way particularly Russian. It doesn't have that slightly unusual international feel you get with people that have kind of grown up in a different culture and have a different way of approaching things. If I didn't know it was Russian, if it was dubbed well and I didn't know it was dubbed, you could be fooled for thinking this is just a pretty crappy American movie. So overall, it was a very disappointing film. It's pretty short, not too much happens in it. It's got certain similarities to The Devil Below, also released this month. I have to say I slightly preferred The Devil Below just because it gave us a little bit more than this does. It's even got slight similarities to The Toll in that it's a kind of creeping about in the woods sort of film. It doesn't have any of the problems that The Toll has, but at the same time it's not as good as the good bits of The Toll. It's ultimately pretty forgettable. It doesn't have any moments or images in it that are particularly memorable that stay with you afterwards. The first half you can pretty much ignore because nothing too interesting set up. There's a shot in it that I think is deliberately meant to reflect a particularly famous image from last year's Gretel and Hansel. It seems a very deliberate quotation of that. I think it wasn't a film that I had any great expectations for, other than the poster and the basic idea of it, and I think I was disappointed on all counts. So overall, I'm going to have to give this 1.5 stars. Just kind of forgettable, low budget, nothing much going on, nothing we haven't seen before, nothing we haven't seen done better. It cherry picks all the worst bits of found footage and has none of the good bits. Music's bad, disappointing, it's a cheat, doesn't feel unique, it's just pretty dull, I'm going to be honest. And dare I say it, it's pretty lame.
Even if she makes it out, she's fucked. Come on, she's literally 10 minutes away from an infection.
Jake, it's horror. 70 years of genre tropes tell us that gore porn is not about logic. It's about the squirm factor.
So that pretty much wraps things up for this month. So all that remains now this month is to do a rundown of my rankings for each of the movies that I've seen this month, from the very worst to the very best. So out of 16 movies I've seen, the very worst movie for this month for me has to be The Seventh Day. Now, it wasn't completely execrable, it was just so bland, so dull, so forgettable, just a really kind of hacky, tired, empty movie with nothing to recommend it whatsoever. I've already forgotten it. It's definitely not a movie that I absolutely suffered through, I just really didn't like it. So I suppose if that is the very worst movie this month, it suggests that it's not necessarily the worst of months if The Seventh Day is the very worst movie of the month. But for me, number 16, The Seventh Day, rubbish. So number 15 is Phobias at 1.5 stars. Phobias was very disappointing. I suppose there were some good ideas in it. There were more ideas in it per square inch than maybe some of the other movies, slightly higher than it, just because it's an anthology. Anthologies you tend to forgive quite a lot. Phobias really felt unfinished. It felt shoddy. I thought the wraparound was really clunky, really badly written. Some okay performers in it, which tend to make you perhaps more forgiving of if you're just getting absolutely bottom of the barrel, Z grade crap actors. But Phobias was pretty disappointing for me. Very, very low budget. Nothing much going on at all. Number 15, The Phobias, disappointing. So next up, the third worst movie of the month for me was The Widow at 1.5 stars. The Widow, Russian movie, found footage trappings, takes all the worst bits of found footage. It's got some okayish atmosphere. I think the dubbing perhaps flattened it. I might have gone very, very slightly higher had it not been dubbed, had I been watching a subtitled version, because there are some okay scenes in it, but my patience wore quite thin on this, and I would have liked to have seen a lot more than I ultimately did. The Widow, disappointing, shallow, nothing original, nothing too exciting. Number 13 for me, coming into the 2 stars bracket, was The Devil Below. Definitely some visual similarities to The Widow. The Devil Below was better for me because it did actually follow through. It did actually have some monsters in it. For a creature feature, quite, heavy-handed. The script's nothing special. I did think the end was kind of quite fun-ish, pretty disposable. A 2-star movie, it's just not great, but I didn't totally suffer whilst I was watching it, put it like that. So The Devil Below, 2 stars, pretty forgettable. Number 12 for me, also at 2 stars, is Dreamcatcher. Dreamcatcher, this very, very 90s throwback slasher with the characters with this very kind of knowing, self-referential dialogue. It's a movie where a lot of the characters in it seem to be horror literate because we're seeing people copying things that are in Scream. Ultimately didn't pan out to anything because the fact that they are horror literate, that they're coming out with these, that they're defining tropes and things on screen doesn't amount to anything because it's just a fairly kind of bitchy, catty story. Again, it's a movie that's got quite a nice ending. I think that elevated it. I do think it's got one of the better soundtracks of the month. I've actually been listening to the soundtrack for Dreamcatcher quite a bit. I think it's quite fun, quite light. I did have some fun whilst watching this, but I did find myself annoyed by the characters a lot, and for me, that is a big thing. At number 12, Dreamcatcher at 2 stars. So at number 11, also in the 2-star bracket, is the Block Island sound. Now, I was swithering about the Block Island sound because the Block Island sound does have some good things about it, which I'll get into later on. I do really like certain aspects of it, but at the end of the day, there's too much time given over to moping and to character scenes of people that I fucking hate. Again, as I just said, characters are a huge thing for me. If you like really annoying characters, if you don't need your characters to be likeable whatsoever, you're probably a bit more forgiving of a movie like The Block Island Sound. But for me, it's kind of a cheat, given where it ultimately goes, that so much of it is given over to just the same tired mental health cliches that we've seen over and over again. Not just in the month, not just in the year, but in the horror genre as a whole for the last few years. So at number 11, The Block Island Sound, 2 stars, really should have been a lot better. Coming into number 10 for me, The Arbors, also at 2 stars, the highest rated 2-star movie of the month for me. The Arbors, very, very long. The length isn't the biggest problem with it. I think it does some interesting things, but it's got a lot of kind of rich metaphorical things about it, things to say about small town basically destroying people, which I think is kind of fun. It's very depressing. The character stuff in it is quite affecting, quite realistic. It is a horror film at the end of the day, and I think it disappoints on that level. I needed a lot more atmosphere. I needed to feel that the director was actually interested in the atmosphere. I didn't want to just see a closeted parable about how crushingly soul-destroying small-town life can be. That's something that I can enjoy on a different level at a different time. I don't need to see people sneaking into the horror genre. So at 2 stars, The Arbors, number 10 for me. Okay, I had issues with it though. Number 9. At 2.5 stars, we've got the lowest rated Canadian film of the month, and that is The Toll. The Toll is a movie, of course, I had a lot of problems with. Fantastic start, okay middle, rubbish end. I could have put this higher, I could have put it lower, but at the end of the day, I think 2.5 stars reflects it fairly. There are probably films that I'd rate higher than The Toll that I probably didn't quite enjoy as much, because there are aspects to The Toll that are very, very entertaining indeed, but at the end of the day, I was just sorely let down by it, which is why I can't go any higher than 2.5 stars. So number 9, The Toll. Next up at number 8, we have Stay Out of the Attic, Stay Out of the fucking Attic, also 2.5 stars. Stay Out of the Attic was quite fun, it was quite pulpy, but it did descend into misery. It's not necessarily as fun as it might be, nor is it as gory and sadistic as you might want from this kind of film, dealing with Nazi experimentations and whatever. It's pretty okay. I mean, at number 8, it comes slap bang in the middle of the month for me, just middle of the road, okay. Nothing great, good characters, but probably something that could be a lot better than it is. So moving on to number 7, we are now in the 3-star bracket. A film that gets 3 stars for me, a 6 out of 10 or above, is a film that I did enjoy. Anything lower than that is something that I enjoyed with reservations. For me, a 3-star movie is a good time. A 4-star film is a film that I really enjoyed, and a 5-star film is, of course, fantastic or perfection. The lowest ranked 3-star film of the month for me at number 7 was Lucky, the Shudder movie. Very heavy-handed. It was saved by this very charismatic lead performance from Bree Grant. It is kind of fun. It does sort of bounce along in quite a kind of kooky way. I think that the more fun, enjoyable aspects of it are ultimately outweighed by the severity of the issues that it's dealing with. So for me, Lucky was okay, but above average, but something I did have some issues with. So number 7 was Lucky. At number 6, also 3 stars, a film I enjoyed more than Lucky, it is Arbors Descent. Arbors Descent did surprise me. It's a Canadian film, which we'll be seeing more of as we go along. Pretty basic, pretty straightforward, nice twist, quite nice style. Arbors Descent is very, very low budget, but it was one of those little gems in the rough that just comes along and surprises you by being entertaining. So number 6 for me, Arbors Descent at 3 stars. Next up, breaking into the top 5 films of the month for me, The Heiress, also at 3 stars. The Heiress, this British film about these characters dealing with an ancestry, dealing with their heritage of the supernatural in their bloodline. It was probably one of the most depressing films of the month for me, certainly. I did find myself enjoying it. I thought the performances were really good. I thought the style was nice. I think the director, Chris Bell, did a very good job for The Heiress. The Heiress, again, a surprise. Low budget, didn't expect anything going into it, and was very, very pleasantly surprised. 3 stars for The Heiress at number 5. So pushing on to number 4, we've got my favourite 3-star film of the month, and that was, of course, The Banishing, also a British film. I really enjoyed The Banishing, very old-fashioned, haunted house kind of ghost story, definitely seems to be stylistically influenced by the film Ghost Story. Really great central performance from Jessica Brown-Findlay. Just a really nice, entertaining ghost story with no great pretensions and quite a nice message about kind of strength and unity. The Banishing I enjoyed a lot. I could maybe go a little bit higher on The Banishing in hindsight, but I think that it really would have needed to kind of punch things up a bit more than it did for me to give it any more than 3 stars. But that said, my favourite 3-star film of the month is The Banishing at number 4. So breaking into the top 3 now, we are finally at the 4-star category. At number 3, we have The Stylist from Arrow. The Stylist was a film I was very much looking forward to. I really enjoyed it. Amazing central performance, really, really great style, really thick, sumptuous imagery. I thought The Stylist was really, really great. As I said, I could probably go higher on The Stylist if I watched it again. I will definitely be checking it out again at some point during the year. I'm interested to see how it holds up for a second watch, but I did really, really enjoy The Stylist. But ultimately, there were 2 films I did enjoy more than The Stylist, both of which I gave more than 4 stars to. Number 2 for me, my second favourite film of the month, was of course from Shudder. My favourite Shudder film of the month, my favourite Shudder film of the year up until this point, it was of course the Canadian film Slaxx. Slaxx was hugely enjoyable, this full-blooded, totally committed satire of woke, posturing, clothes industry, millennials, hipsters. I loved it. I think it's a well-written, a clever film, really fun effects in it, really great idea, really, really entertaining. Slaxx was amazing, 4.5 stars for me. Slaxx will definitely be a film that I will come back to again and again. And of course, there was a film I enjoyed more than Slaxx. It probably shouldn't come as any surprise to you if you've actually listened to the podcast up until this point, if you actually listened to my review of it, that my favourite film of the month and my favourite film of the year up until this point is, of course, the Canadian classic Come True. Come True is a film that I had absolutely no expectations going into Come True. I'd really not heard anything about it. I'd just seen this, the main central image for it, and I went into it totally blind, and I was fucking blown away. It was one of the best films I've seen in a very, very long time. Really amazing, really fantastic imagery, really fantastic style. Come True is without doubt the best film of the month. A film that I would recommend to everybody. Please check it out. Ideally buy it on Blu-ray when it comes out. It'll be coming out at the start of next month. It is just amazing. Come True, my favourite film of the month, my favourite film of the year up until this point, and without doubt, proof once again that Canadian cinema does it like nobody else. So that concludes the ranking rundown for this month. That's all the films that I've seen this month put in order. It only remains for me to give some special shout outs, to do my sort of award ceremony where I'm going to single out certain aspects of films for praise. We'll start with my favourite performance of the month. There were a lot of good performances here. I think quite opaque, sombre characters tended to dominate this month, I have to say. I thought that both the lead performances in The Toll were really fantastic. I think Jessica Brown-Findlay in The Banishing was amazing. I thought Candice Nergard in The Heiress was very, very good, very likeable, very charismatic. I think even Brie Grant in Lucky was amazing. Of course, I think the acting in Come True was fantastic because it was such a good film. I think the acting in Slaxx was really good, but I think both of those films had a stronger overall style rather than being films that were dominated by a single standout performance, which means that I'm going to have to say that my favourite performance of this month was, of course, Najara Townsend as the Stylist. I think it's really a film that's built around this amazing central performance. It's not too ostentatious, it's not too over the top. and yet she's still got this absolute strength and really watchable quality that enables her to carry almost the entire weight of the film by herself, even though the visuals are really fantastic, the score is amazing, and I think the film overall is fantastic. But I have to say that I think her performance is the standout of this month. Najara Townsend nailed it this month in The Stylist. So next up we have Best Soundtrack. I'm a huge lover of soundtrack music. I think a really great soundtrack, especially in the horror genre, can work wonders. There were a lot of soundtracks, again, that I thought were pretty interesting. I have to say I don't think it was the best month for really kind of standout memorable soundtracks on their own. There were a few that kind of worked well in the film. Stuff like the Arbors had a really nice kind of stripped back soundtrack. Amber's Descent had a nice kind of lyrical thing going on. I thought that was a pretty interesting soundtrack. The Heiress was pretty good. It got very kind of emotional, the music in that film. And of course Come True, which I'm not going to give the best soundtrack of this month for the simple reason that I could easily just say that every single one of these awards belongs to Come True just because it's such an amazing film. Come True is my second favourite soundtrack of the month. It was a really, really nice kind of throwback, dark, moody kind of synth score that I thought was really fantastic. The Stylist again had a really nice soundtrack that fit that film very well. It didn't necessarily have that much of an identity in itself. As I mentioned before, I thought Dreamcatcher had a really nice soundtrack that kind of infused more electronica kind of influenced sounds into its soundscape. But for me, bizarrely, my favourite soundtrack of the month, the one that I thought really, really stood out, was Paul Cox's score for The Block Island Sound, which is weird because I thought The Block Island Sound wasn't the best film in the world, but I think the soundtrack was really, really doing some heavy lifting. I think probably if you took that soundtrack, I would go down an entire point on the Block Island Sound. I thought the soundtrack was phenomenal and that really, really interesting. And I think it's very, very sad that that soundtrack hasn't got a proper release. There is about, I think, 15 to 20 minutes of music up on SoundCloud from it that I've been listening to, but I think the Block Island Sound's soundtrack, I think its score really elevated that movie, and that's why I'm going to single it out for praise. Even though the film wasn't great, I thought the soundtrack was tremendous. So next up, we're just going to come back to something else, which was my favourite title of the month. Now, titles are interesting because looking at the films this month, I think the titles are terrible. I think even for films that I like, the titles aren't great. I think Come True is a bad title. Things like Phobias, The Widow, The Toll, Lucky, The Heiress, The Banishing, titles that say absolutely nothing about the film whatsoever, minimalist, uninteresting, stuff that doesn't really grab you. I know titles aren't really talked about that much. A title tends to be just a point of reference so people know what you're talking about when you're talking about a film. But in this particular case, I have to say for me, the most evocative and interesting title this month was once again The Block Island Sound. I think that's a really nice little title. Again, it's a really good title for a film that's not great. As you can probably tell by now, I found myself thinking that I should be liking The Block Island Sound a lot more than I did, but at the end of the day, too much moping in it. But I think the title alone is very evocative, very nice, very well chosen. They could have gone with something a lot duller that maybe would have reflected the film more, but I think The Block Island Sound is a really nice title. I think it's the one that really stands out for me this month. Honourable mentions for The Seventh Days, a pretty fun title. And of course, Stay Out of the Fucking Attic is its own thing. But yeah, The Block Island Sound, my favourite choice of words for a title this month. I think next I'm going to do my biggest surprise of this month. So this is a film that I didn't expect anything from that really surprised me the most. So this can't be a film that I was looking forward to or a film that was hyped up for me. So, of course, you probably guessed it. The film that surprised me the most, my biggest surprise this month, was, of course, Come True, because I didn't expect anything going in, and it fucking knocked me out. It was so good to Come True. I'm really, really having trouble squeezing my love for Come True out. It's such a fantastic film. It surprised the shit out of me. Probably, quite literally, my jaw was hitting the floor whilst I was watching it. It's such a great film, such an amazing surprise. It really, really blew me away. Other surprises for me this month were The Banishing, The Heiress, and Amber's Descent. Were all quite middle of the road, but very entertaining. Things that I wasn't really expecting too much of going in. All films that I watched near the end of the month when I was sort of deciding that I needed to miss certain things out. Ultimately prioritised these films, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised. But the biggest or best surprise for me this month was, of course, Come True. And from biggest surprise, we of course have to come to biggest disappointment. So this was a film that I was expecting to be really good and was very let down by. of course. The Block Island sound, I suppose, could go in there. I wasn't really expecting anything too much from it, but I was very, very disappointed in it. I think Phobias and The Widow, I wasn't expecting anything from, but I was disappointed by, just because they didn't realise their potential whatsoever. In a way, even though I didn't enjoy it, The Arbors was more of a surprise than a disappointment to me, because I expected to really hate it, and I ended up quite liking aspects of it, but just not really enjoying it much overall. But for me, the biggest disappointment this month, of course, has to be Canada's own The Toll. I didn't expect anything going into The Toll, but the first act of it set me up for something really great, and I was so crushed by the end of it. The Toll really, really annoyed me. Biggest disappointment, biggest annoyance for me as well, The Toll. I think even if I'd gone into it completely blind, which I more or less did, it's still the biggest disappointment just because of what it could have been, and because, you know, quite a lot of it was really good and the rest of it was just utter shit. Biggest disappointment, The Toll, without a doubt. So finally, we come to Best Director of the Month. My favourite director, the person who I think did a really fantastic job with what they're doing, the one that really, really stood out to me as being memorable and unique and worth watching in the future. Once again, I could go with Come True, because I think Come True was amazing, but in Come True, I think the direction was really great. I think the imagery in it was amazing. I think overall, though, there was a film that I think had a better overall kind of aesthetic and command of performances. I think Come True, the visuals in it were without doubt the best visuals of the month. But there was a film that I think overall impressed me more. It wasn't Slaxx, which I enjoyed immensely and I thought was really well directed. I think Slaxx, I was more impressed by the performances and the script. But for me, the best direction this month does of course come from Jill Gevargizian, or Jill 6, director of The Stylist. I think she did a fantastic job. I think The Stylist is the perfect blend of great performances, great style, great music, great aesthetic. It all comes together into this lovely, lush, amazingly dense package of goodness. It's not ashamed of its horror, it's not ashamed of its character aspects. It merges everything really, really nicely together, and I think she did a fantastic job for it. I can't wait to see what she does next, which is why my favourite director of the month is Jill Gevargizian, and maybe for her next directorial effort, I'll finally work out how to pronounce her name correctly. So, sorry, Jill Gevargizian, if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but you did an amazing job. You're my favourite director of the month. So I think that wraps things up for this month. One last thing I'm going to do is, what I've done is I've added up all my scores for the month. I'm going to work out my average rating for a film this month, just to see kind of roughly where March 2021 comes in the grand scheme of things. This isn't necessarily reflective of anything. It's ultimately a pretty pointless exercise, because I think with the horror genre, and I think if you're watching this many films a month in general, inevitably you're going to watch a lot of rubbish, so that's going to drag the average down. There are some pretty good films this month. There are also some pretty poor films this month. I have to say, I think there wasn't a single film that I really, really hated this month. There's nothing that I found absolutely painful. So just bear with me a second. My average rating for a film this month is, believe it or not, 5.3 out of 10. So just above average, just slightly above average. For me, a 6 out of 10 is a film I like. A 5 out of 10 is a film that's okay. 5.3, it's okay. We'll have to wait and see how that pans out against some other months. I think that's reasonable enough. I didn't find myself blown away by this month. I think anything on the sort of 3 stars and above I really enjoyed. Only 3 films that I'd consider really, really great horror films, which were of course Come True, Slaxx and The Stylist, 2 of which were Canadian. It's been a pretty interesting month so far. I've enjoyed it. I've seen quite a lot of the same things kind of played out. Definitely, I think, mental health and kind of films that are quite wary of their genre, that tend to relegate sort of supernatural imagery and things to dream sequences or visions. I've seen an awful lot of this month. I'd kind of like to see maybe a bit less of that. I think there hasn't been a great many really fantastic performance-driven movies. I think The Stylist's the one that really stands out for me. I'd like to see more films built around really, really strong performances. Really only, I think, Dreamcatcher was the only slasher that I watched this month. I suppose you could count The Stylist, but I personally wouldn't. No real found footage films apart from maybe The Widow. Nothing from any notable horror directors, in my opinion. An awful lot of first-timers. Overall, it's been an interesting month, an interesting collection of very odd and very unique films. Suggesting that March 2021 is a 5.3 out of 10 is a little bit harsh. I think if I'd watched more really bad films, it would be lower than that. There probably are some films out there that I think would be quite decent. I think maybe Sun, from the sounds of it, might be okay. I kind of chose not to watch that, I have to say. Violation, I stayed away from Violation because I really, really didn't like the sound of it. It doesn't sound like anything I want from a horror film. The Gingerweed Man from Full Moon, I, of course, stayed away from. I've actually not seen any of those Ginger Dead Man, Evil Bong movies. The idea of these kind of ridiculous stoner kind of horror comedies really doesn't appeal to me whatsoever. I think even if it was a more kind of out-and-out horror film as opposed to ultra-low-budget spoof, I might have given it a shot. But I don't feel deprived not having seen The Gingerweed Man. Making Monsters was a film that I was quite interested to see. I was seeing a lot of people saying that the characters are really, really annoying, and I think the leads in it are meant to be playing sort of YouTube pranksters. I kind of like the sound of that, I have to say. I spent a lot of time trying to find a copy of it to watch. Couldn't find it. I probably would have watched Making Monsters had I been able to find a copy by the end of this month. I'll probably watch it in the next couple of days if I can find it, on Amazon or iTunes or whatever. I don't know where I'd have come in on that, of course, not having seen it. But I suppose the fact I didn't watch it, I ultimately, I think the film I would have watched, if I had watched Making Monsters, I probably wouldn't have watched Amber's Descent, which I think, I'm glad I watched it because I did like Amber's Descent. You can never watch every single horror movie ever released because there's just too much dross out there. But I'd say there's probably about half a dozen movies that I could have watched that I decided not to, or that I didn't get time for, or I couldn't find, that might have changed things. They might have punched that average up, they might have brought it down. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the month so far, and I am absolutely looking forward to seeing what next month has to bring. As I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to say very quickly, I've watched 16 films this month, which brings my total up to 25 2021 films watched this year up until now. Out of those 16, 6 of these films are now currently sitting in my top 10. I keep a list of, I rank every film I watch for the year from best to worst. 6 of the movies from March have got into my top 10, which I think is more reflective of the fact that I've just not really watched that much in January or February. I can't see too many of them staying there over the course of the year. I think definitely, though, Come True is going to be a juggernaut for me this year, and I'm honestly excited to see if anything else this year comes close to it, because I think it's going to take something really incredible to knock that off the top spot. When the time comes, I will of course be doing a top 10 of 2021 at the end of the year, and I imagine I would probably be willing to put money on the fact that Come True will be in there in at least the top 3 for me. But who knows what's coming? Who knows what's around the corner? I wasn't expecting anything from Come True. I'd barely even heard of it. And who knows where the next hidden gem is going to be. So I guess it's probably time to bring this to an end right now. I think I've said everything I need to say for this month. If anyone is still around, thank you very, very much for sticking around. You've probably got more stamina and patience than I do. But hopefully you're somebody that really enjoys the horror genre, you're really interested in finding out what new stuff's out there. Please keep checking out new horror films as they come out. Please support as many horror films as you can. Please don't resort to watching stuff illegally. It's not fair, it doesn't support the horror genre whatsoever. It can be an expensive business, I know, but you just got to appreciate that if you want people to keep making films that they love, in this genre that we all love so much, then you just gotta occasionally fork out some cash and support the people, even if it's for total shit. Rent their stuff, whatever, because even making a crap film takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and I appreciate even the really crap films. So with that out of the way, I guess it's time to say good night, one and all. Thank you very, very much for listening, and I shall see you next month with the April 2021 edition of the Month in Horror podcast. Thank you very much, and good night, one and all.